My name is Harper. I am 31 years old, and I am a forensic accountant working right here in the heart of Chicago. Get out of the car right now, with your hands where I can see them. The police officer screamed at the top of his lungs, his heavy service weapon drawn and aimed directly at the center of my windshield. I was being arrested at gunpoint in the middle of a busy intersection for a felony hit and run. Across town, my younger sister and my parents were likely popping champagne and celebrating, absolutely certain that I was about to go to federal prison for a horrific crash she caused. I let the cold steel handcuffs click shut around my wrists without a single fight. They thought they had framed the perfect scapegoat. They just forgot one tiny, very expensive detail. It was a rainy Tuesday evening, the kind of dreary Chicago night where the streetlights reflect sharply off the wet pavement. I was just driving home from a quick trip to the grocery store. My passenger seat was full of mundane things like almond milk and fresh vegetables. I was mentally preparing for a quiet night of analyzing spreadsheets. I turned the corner onto my street and suddenly, the world exploded into blinding red and blue lights. Sirens shrieked from every direction. 3 police cruisers swarmed my modest Honda Accord in a synchronized violent maneuver, boxing me in so tightly that I could not move the steering wheel an inch. Before my brain could even process the flashing lights, my driver's side window was surrounded. Flashlights blinded me. I heard aggressive pounding on the glass and terrifying, deafening shouts instructing me to turn off the engine and throw my keys out the window. My hands trembled violently. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I fumbled with the ignition, my fingers numb with absolute terror, and dropped the keys onto the wet asphalt. The door was yanked open with incredible force. Rough hands grabbed my shoulders, hauling me out into the freezing rain. I was shoved hard against the cold, slick hood of my own car. The metal dug into my chest as a heavy hand pressed between my shoulder blades. I squeezed my eyes shut, gasping for air, completely paralyzed by the shock of the assault. The harsh bite of steel handcuffs snapped tightly around my wrists, locking my arms behind my back. The cold rain soaked through my thin blouse, chilling me to the bone. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the psychological terror of being treated like a violent criminal in front of my own neighbors. What is going on? I managed to choke out my voice, cracking into a pathetic sob. I have not done anything wrong. Please, you have the wrong person. The arresting officer spun me around and shoved me toward the back of his cruiser. His face was a mask of pure disgust. "Save it!" He snarled, his grip tightening aggressively on my arm. "You are being charged with a felony hit and run. You left a pregnant woman bleeding out on the pavement just 3 hours ago. She is in critical condition fighting for her life while you were out buying groceries like nothing happened." The words slammed into my chest, knocking the remaining breath out of my lungs. A pregnant woman. A hit and run. My knees buckled slightly, but the officer hauled me upright. I shook my head frantically, rain and tears mixing on my face. "No," I pleaded, my voice rising in pure panic. "That is impossible. I have been at my apartment working all day. I only left 20 minutes ago to get food. I have not been driving my car." The officer let out a dark, humorless laugh as he opened the door to the cruiser. "We have witnesses who identified this exact Honda Accord fleeing the scene at 70 miles per hour, he stated coldly. "And unless you have an identical twin who carries your exact driver license, you are going away for a very long time. We found your ID sitting right there in the gutter next to the victim." He pushed me into the hard plastic backseat of the police car and slammed the door shut, locking me inside a claustrophobic cage of dark-tinted glass and wire mesh. I sat there shivering, the siren wailing above my head, while the officers outside began searching my trunk. The air in the back of the cruiser smelled like stale sweat and bleach. My mind raced wildly, desperately trying to connect the impossible dots. My car, my ID, a horrific crash 3 hours ago, but I had not driven my car in 3 days. I had lent my keys to the one person I thought I could trust, the one person who always needed a favor. The ride to the precinct was a chaotic blur of flashing neon and the rhythmic thumping of windshield wipers against the heavy rain. The officers pulled me out of the cruiser and marched me through the back entrance of the police station. The building smelled of old coffee dam wool and industrial floor wax. Everything was harsh fluorescent light and cold gray linoleum. The officers did not speak a single word to me. They processed me with an aggressive efficiency that made me feel entirely subhuman. They took my fingerprints, they took my photograph, They confiscated my shoelaces and my belt. My wet blouse clung to my freezing skin, but I was shaking too violently from pure adrenaline to even feel the cold. I was escorted down a long, narrow hallway lined with heavy metal doors and forcefully shoved into a windowless interrogation room. The heavy steel door shut behind me with a definitive, echoing slam that vibrated deep within my chest. The room was exactly as stark and terrifying as you see on television. There was one metal table, securely bolted to the cold concrete floor, and two rigid, uncomfortable chairs. A large mirror covered one entire wall, which I instantly knew was a two-way observation window. I sat there completely alone for what felt like hours. Every passing second stretched into an eternity of sheer, suffocating panic. My mind spiraled through 1,000 chaotic, terrifying questions. A pregnant woman was fighting for her life. My car was the weapon. My license was the evidence. None of it made any logical sense. I pressed my freezing palms against my face, desperately trying to stop the room from spinning. I had spent my entire adult life meticulously following the rules. As a forensic accountant, my entire career was built on absolute integrity, unwavering precision, and total transparency. I lived a quiet, disciplined life. Now I was sitting in a police holding room, branded a violent, reckless felon facing years behind bars. The heavy lock on this door suddenly clicked. A detective walked in. He was a broad-shouldered man wearing a rumpled gray suit. His face was deeply lined with profound exhaustion and raw disgust. He carried a thick manila folder and a clear plastic evidence bag. He did not introduce himself. He did not offer me a glass of water or a blanket to warm my shivering body. He threw the thick folder onto the metal table with a loud, aggressive smack. He pulled out the rigid chair opposite me and sat down heavily. For a long, agonizing moment, he just stared at me. It was a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. I desperately tried to speak, but my throat was entirely dry. I forced out a raspy, terrified whisper, pleading with him to tell me what was happening and assuring him that this was a catastrophic mistake. The detective leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the cold steel table. "You know," he began, his voice dangerously quiet. "In my 20 years working on this force, I have seen a lot of cowards. I have seen people do terrible, horrific things and run away out of fear. But leaving a pregnant mother critically injured on the wet pavement, bleeding out in the street while you speed away to buy groceries, takes a very special kind of sociopath." I shook my head frantically. The tight steel cuffs dug painfully into my wrists as I gripped the hard edge of the table. "I did not do this," I cried out, my voice finally finding its strength. "I was at home working all day. I only left my apartment to go to the grocery store down the street. My car was parked in my assigned residential spot. I swear to you, I have not driven my car anywhere else tonight." The detective did not even blink at my desperate pleas. He simply reached for the clear plastic evidence bag he had brought in and slid it slowly across the metal table until it stopped right in front of my trembling hands. "Take a good look," he commanded coldly. I looked down at the table. Inside the sealed plastic bag was my driver license. It showed my face, my full name, and my home address. The plastic edges of the license were smeared with dark, wet mud and small reddish-brown droplets. Blood. My stomach violently lurched. The room suddenly felt completely devoid of oxygen. We found that exact piece of identification exactly 3 feet from where the pregnant victim was thrown by the brutal impact of your vehicle, the detective stated firmly, his words hitting me like physical blows. "Your car has massive front-end damage that perfectly matches the impact site. The paint transfer found on the victim clothing matches your exact make and model. And then we found your ID sitting right there in the gutter, dropped in your frantic, reckless rush to flee the crime scene." I stared blankly at my smiling face on that plastic card. My rational mind halted, then violently reversed, tearing through the last 72 hours of my life. I had not driven my car in 3 days. I had been working entirely from home conducting a massive remote audit. My actual car keys had been sitting on my kitchen counter. But 3 days ago, on Saturday morning, my younger sister Blair had shown up at my apartment. She was frantic, pacing my living room, claiming her luxury Audi was having sudden engine trouble and was currently stuck in the shop. She claimed she desperately needed a reliable vehicle for a weekend trip to the suburbs. She played the helpless, vulnerable victim perfectly. She cried, she manipulated, and like I always did, I handed over my keys without a single question. I explicitly told her that the spare key fob had my backup driver license tucked securely into the attached leather pouch just for emergencies. The horrific truth crashed over me with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. Blair, my beautiful, privileged, golden child sister who had never faced a single consequence in her entire life. She was driving my car tonight. She was the one who hit that poor, innocent woman. And in her blind, intoxicated panic, she had deliberately dropped my spare identification at the bloody crime scene to deflect the police away from herself. She drove my damaged car back to my neighborhood, parked it, and walked away perfectly, framing me for a violent felony. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal completely paralyzed my vocal cords. My own flesh and blood had actively set me up to rot in a federal prison just to save her own flawless reputation and protect her lavish lifestyle. I looked up at the detective. The tears welling in my eyes were no longer born from fear or confusion. They were born from a sudden, blinding, overwhelming rage. It was my sister, I said, my voice dropping to a trembling but fierce whisper. I lent my car to my sister 3 days ago. She has had it the entire weekend. That is my spare license in the bag. She knew it was in the key pouch, in the siege. The detective scoffed loudly, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his face with sheer disbelief. Do you really expect me to believe that you are actively blaming your own sister for this horrific crime? He asked mockingly. You people always try to throw someone else under the bus when the walls finally close in. It is absolutely pathetic. He opened his thick folder and began to formally read me my rights. I realized in that exact second that absolutely nothing I said to this man would matter. He had his suspect, he had his physical evidence, and he had his narrative perfectly tied up with a neat bow. I needed to act immediately. I needed an attorney. I needed to expose the actual monsters I foolishly called my family. I slammed my hands down hard on the metal table, the chains of my cuffs rattling loudly in the confined space. I am not answering another single question without a lawyer present, I demanded firmly, my voice echoing sharply off the concrete walls. And I demand my phone call right now. I need to call my parents. The detective stared at me for a long moment after my demand. His expression remained completely stoic. He slowly gathered his thick manila folder and the clear plastic evidence bag containing my bloody driver license. He stood up from the metal table, pushed his rigid chair back, and walked out of the interrogation room without saying a single word. The heavy steel door slammed shut, locking me inside. I sat there in the absolute silence, my chest heaving as I struggled to pull air into my burning lungs. 10 minutes passed. Every second felt like physical torture. Finally, a female uniformed officer opened the door. She unclipped a set of keys from her duty belt and motioned for me to stand up. She escorted me down another narrow concrete hallway to a small alcove where a heavy metal telephone was mounted to the cinder block wall. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely lift the receiver. The metal was freezing against my ear. I had one phone call, one chance to reach the people who were supposed to protect me. I dialed the familiar 10 digits of my parents' home phone number in the suburbs. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs as the line rang. It was late into the evening, and I desperately prayed they were awake. On the fourth ring, the line clicked open. I heard my father Richard clear his throat. "Hello?" He answered, his voice sounding completely normal, undisturbed. "Dad?" I gasped out, choking on my own tears. "Dad, it is Harper. I am at the police station. I have been arrested. They think I committed a felony hit and run, but I did not do it. Blair had my car. She had my spare key with my license. Dad, you have to help me. Please, you have to come down here." There was a strange, terrible silence on the other end of the line. I expected him to shout in horror. I expected him to ask which precinct I was at so he could rush over. I expected the frantic, chaotic panic of a parent discovering their child was in profound danger. Instead, I heard muffled shifting sounds. He was covering the receiver. Then another voice came on the line. It was my mother, Susan. "Harper," my mother said. Her voice was not panicked. It was not terrified. It was eerily, utterly calm. It was the exact same measured, controlled tone she used when she was rescheduling a dental appointment or ordering coffee. "Mom," I sobbed, gripping the heavy metal phone cord like a lifeline. "Mom, please listen to me." Blair was driving my car. She hit a pregnant woman. The police found my backup driver license at the scene, and they are charging me with a violent felony. You need to call Blair right now. You need to tell them the truth. I am locked in a police station, and I am so scared. Harper, my mother repeated, cutting off my desperate pleading. I need you to listen to me very carefully. You need to just cooperate with the officers. Do not cause a scene, and do not make things more difficult than they already are. We will look into getting you a public defender tomorrow morning. My brain simply could not process the words coming out of her mouth. A public defender. Cooperate. Mama, I stammered, my voice cracking into a high-pitched whisper. What are you talking about? I did not do this. Blair did this. She was the one driving. Do not mention Blair, my mother snapped. Her voice dropped low, dropping the pleasant facade and revealing a sharp, cold edge that sliced right through my soul. Do not drag your sister into this mess, Harper. She has far too much to lose right now. Her entire reputation is on the line. You, on the other hand, are single. You have a quiet desk job. You can bounce back from this. You have always been so resilient. Just take the fall. Do it for the family. The breath left my body completely. I stood there staring at the blank cinder block wall as the horrific reality of her words washed over me. Before I could even form a single syllable in response, the line clicked. A dial tone buzzed harshly in my ear. She had hung up on me. She had actually hung up the phone. The uniformed officer gently took the receiver from my frozen fingers and hung it up. She placed a hand on my shoulder and guided me away from the wall. I walked like a ghost, entirely numb, completely disconnected from my own body. She led me to a holding cell, a sterile concrete box with a thin metal bench and a rusted toilet in the corner. The heavy barred door clanged shut, locking me inside the freezing cell. I sank down onto the hard metal bench and pulled my knees tightly against my chest. The physical cold of the jail cell was absolutely nothing compared to the freezing void expanding inside my chest. The pieces of the puzzle began to violently assemble in my mind, forming a picture so utterly monstrous that it made my stomach churn. My mother had not been surprised by my phone call. She had not asked a single question about the accident. She did not ask where the crash happened or who was hurt. She already knew. The realization hit me like a massive physical blow. Blair had not acted alone. When she panicked after striking that poor innocent woman, she had called our parents. She had run to them for help. And my mother and father, the people who brought me into this world, had actively sat down and plotted to sacrifice me. They had consciously decided that Blair and her flawless high society life were simply worth more than my freedom. They actively helped her plant my identification to frame me. They deliberately instructed her to drop my driver license next to a bleeding woman to ensure the police would come hunting for me instead of their precious golden child. I wrapped my arms around my legs, burying my face in my knees as silent tears spilled down my cheeks. For my entire life, I had been the family human shield. I was the one who paid my own way through state college while they funded her private tuition. I was the one who quietly covered their mortgage payments when my father decided to retire early. I made myself small, invisible, and relentlessly useful, just desperately hoping that one day they would look at me with the same blinding affection they reserved solely for Blair. And this was my ultimate reward. I was disposable. I was nothing more than a convenient scapegoat bred specifically to absorb the devastating consequences of my sister's reckless actions. As I sat shivering in that desolate holding cell, watching the shadows stretch across the concrete floor, a profound transformation began to take root deep within my spirit. The terrified, desperate girl who had dialed that phone, looking for her parents, died right there on that metal bench. The tears stopped falling. My trembling hands slowly steadied into tight, rigid fists. The crushing heartbreak evaporated completely, replaced by a cold, calculating, and absolute rage. They thought I would just quietly accept my fate. They thought I would lay down and let them ruin my life to protect her. They were completely wrong. The concrete floor of the holding cell radiated a damp, bitter cold that seeped right through the soles of my shoes. I sat on that rigid metal bench, staring at the rusted bars and listening to the distant metallic echoes of the police station. My wrists throbbed where the steel cuffs had bitten into my skin, but the physical pain was completely eclipsed by the agonizing betrayal shattering my heart. My own mother and father had just commanded me to take the fall for a violent felony. They had instructed me to blindly accept a prison sentence for a horrific crime my younger sister committed. As I wrapped my arms around my shivering body, the agonizing truth began to crystallize in the dark corners of that cell. This ultimate betrayal was not a sudden out-of-character decision. This was the logical, terrifying conclusion to a dynamic that had defined my entire existence. I was never a daughter to them. I was a human shield. Growing up in our middle-class suburban home, I learned very early that love was a finite resource, and Blair held an absolute monopoly on it. She was 2 years younger, with a magnetic, infectious energy that easily charmed everyone around her. When she struggled with her classes, my parents immediately hired expensive private tutors, stretching their budget to the absolute breaking point to ensure her success. I, on the other hand, was the quiet, invisible worker. I taught myself how to study. I forged my own path because my achievements were simply expected and instantly forgotten. The profound disparity only widened as we grew older. When it was time for college, Blair set her sights on an exorbitant private university across the country. My parents took out massive predatory loans to fund her dream, completely ignoring the devastating financial strain it put on our family. When my turn came just 2 years later, my mother sat me down and explained with a heavy sigh that the college fund was entirely depleted. She told me I was resourceful and pragmatic. She told me I would easily figure it out. So I did. I enrolled in a local state college. I worked grueling 40-hour weeks, juggling late-night shifts and early morning gigs while carrying a full course load. I paid for absolutely every single textbook, every credit hour, and every meal entirely by myself. I graduated completely debt-free with a degree in forensic accounting, driven by a desperate need to build a secure, stable life. But the more independent and successful I became, the more they leaned on me to subsidize Blair and her reckless choices. 5 years ago, my father abruptly decided to retire early from his corporate management job. The reality was that his impulsive retirement left them drowning in a massive, suffocating mortgage they could no longer afford. They called me to their house, and my mother cried genuine tears, detailing how they were going to lose the family home. She looked at me, her successful, responsible daughter, and begged for my help, claiming that family always protects family. Desperate for the unconditional love and validation I had been craving my entire life, I foolishly agreed. For 5 long years, I silently transferred $3,000 every single month to cover their mortgage. I sacrificed my own savings to keep a roof over the heads of the people who were currently leaving me to rot in a holding cell, while I was quietly funding my parents' survival. Blair was living a life of absolute luxury. 3 years ago, she married a wonderful, intelligent orthopedic surgeon named Marcus. Despite Marcus coming from a very successful, prominent African-American family who offered to help with the costs my parents insisted on paying for the extravagant wedding to keep up appearances. They threw a lavish $60,000 country club reception for my sister, maxing out credit cards, just to make Blair look like royalty. I attended that wedding wearing a clearance rack dress, deeply exhausted from working a massive corporate audit the night before. I watched my father cry tears of overwhelming joy as he walked her down the aisle. I stood at the very edge of the family portraits, just hoping that my reliable, quiet support would eventually earn me a fraction of that profound affection. I was the reliable, invisible workhorse, while Blair was the untouchable golden child. Every time Blair stumbled, I was the one expected to clean up the mess. When she crashed her first car in high school, I gave her my savings to pay the secret deductible. When she overdrew her credit cards in college, I quietly transferred funds to balance her accounts. I was relentlessly conditioned to absorb her failures. My parents trained me meticulously year after year to believe that my sole purpose on this earth was to facilitate my sister and her happiness. They built a psychological cage around me, using guilt obligation and the toxic illusion of family loyalty to keep me firmly locked inside. That is exactly why I had handed over my car keys to her 3 days ago without a single moment of hesitation. It was just another deeply ingrained reflex. She had shown up at my apartment crying about her luxury vehicle being in the shop. She manipulated my lifelong habit of rescuing her. I never considered that she was actively hunting for a burner car. I simply handed over the keys because that is what the family scapegoat is programmed to do. We surrender our resources and security to protect the golden child from the real world. Sitting on that freezing metal bench, the grand, horrifying tapestry of my life finally came into razor-sharp focus. Every ignored achievement and unpaid bill I shouldered was leading directly to this exact catastrophic moment. My parents did not view me as their daughter. They viewed me as an asset. When Blair drove my car into a pregnant pedestrian while severely intoxicated, she did not panic and faced the consequences like a responsible adult. She called our mother, and our mother, the woman whose mortgage I paid every single month, made a cold, calculated, terrifyingly rational choice. She weighed her two daughters on a scale. On one side was Blair, whose perfect marriage could not be tarnished by a felony conviction. On the other side was me, the quiet, self-sufficient accountant used to carrying heavy burdens alone. They knew exactly what they were doing when they instructed her to drop my driver license in the bloody street. They knew the police would track the registration to my apartment. They genuinely believed I was so deeply conditioned to seek their approval that I would simply bow my head, accept a public defender, and take a plea deal. They thought I would trade my freedom to save Blair from a prison cell. But as I leaned my head back against the damp cinder block wall, the profound, desperate longing for my parents to love me suddenly scarred over and hardened into solid steel. I was no longer the obedient, invisible workhorse. They had built a criminal conspiracy to frame me, but profoundly underestimated the exact skills they had forced me to develop. I was a forensic accountant, and as I sat in that dark holding cell waiting for the dawn, I promised myself that I would burn their perfect illusion to the ground. Sitting on that rigid metal bench, the cold seeping aggressively through my damp clothes, I forced my panicked brain to slow down. I needed to reconstruct exactly how my keys ended up in her manicured hands. I needed to understand the precise anatomy of this monstrous trap. It was Saturday morning just 3 days ago. The relentless Chicago rain had not started yet. The morning sun was bright and deceiving. I was sitting at my kitchen island, drinking black coffee and meticulously reviewing complex financial portfolios when a frantic, aggressive knock shattered the quiet sanctuary of my apartment. It was Blair. She looked perfectly disheveled, an act she had mastered since early childhood. Her expensive designer sunglasses were pushed back into her pristine blonde hair, and she was actively forcing artificial tears into her wide eyes. She stood trembling in my doorway, panting as if she had just run a marathon. She told me Marcus was out of town attending a critical orthopedic surgery conference in Boston for the entire weekend. She claimed her brand new luxury Audi was making a terrifying metallic grinding noise and was currently stuck at the dealership. She told me she was supposed to drive up to a luxury spa resort in Lake Geneva for a highly anticipated weekend getaway with her wealthy country club friends. She begged me, saying, "Harper, please, my car is completely unsafe and the dealership cannot give me a loaner until Monday morning. I cannot miss this trip. You know how incredibly stressed I have been lately. You never use your car on the weekends anyway. You just sit inside and work." She played her role with absolute flawless precision. She weaponized my lifelong conditioning to fix her problems and absorb her inconveniences. She knew I never went anywhere socially. She knew I would feel immense guilt for having a perfectly functional vehicle sitting idle in my assigned residential parking spot while she was supposedly in distress. I did not ask for proof about her broken engine. I did not ask why none of her elite friends could simply drive her to the resort. I simply stood up, walked over to the ceramic bowl by the front door, and handed her my keys. I even warned her in a moment of profound tragic irony that my spare driver license was tucked away inside the glove box, right inside a small zippered pouch with my vehicle registration. I explicitly told her to be careful because the registration pouch had all my current insurance information. She snatched the keys directly from my hand, wrapped her arms around my neck for a brief obligatory hug, and vanished out the door without a second glance. The entire interaction lasted less than 5 minutes. 5 minutes was all it took for my own sister to secure the exact weapon she needed to permanently destroy my life. The horrifying truth echoing in the bleak, oppressive silence of that holding cell was so profoundly sinister, it made my chest physically ache with sharp stabbing pains. Blair never intended to go to a luxury spa resort in Lake Geneva. Her beautiful, pristine Audi was not broken. She did not need my modest Honda Accord for a relaxing weekend getaway with her friends. She needed a burner car. She needed a vehicle completely untethered from her immaculate high society image. She needed a car that Marcus, her brilliant, upstanding husband, would never see, returning home with a crushed bumper and a shattered headlight. I pieced together her actual weekend timeline with a sickening crystal clarity. She had stayed right here in the city. She had spent her Saturday and Sunday exactly as she always did whenever Marcus was out of town working to save lives. She spent a day drinking at the exclusive country club, sipping expensive vodka cocktails and showing off for her elite social circle without her responsible husband there to monitor her intake. And then the torrential rain started. She had climbed into my car severely intoxicated, her judgment entirely obliterated by alcohol and an absolute staggering sense of lifelong entitlement. She drove my car through the wet, slick streets of downtown Chicago. She was speeding recklessly through dark residential intersections, completely indifferent to the world around her, until the horrific, inevitable moment occurred. She struck a pregnant woman. The physical impact must have been catastrophic. The sound of metal hitting flesh must have been deafening. But my sister did not stop to render aid. She did not call an ambulance to save the life of a dying mother and her unborn child. She panicked. Her first and only instinct was pure, selfish, cowardly self-preservation. She pulled over several blocks away, hiding in the dark shadows of a quiet side street, and began the systematic process of erasing herself from the violent crime. She wiped down the steering wheel. She furiously scrubbed the door handles, the dashboard, and the gear shift, eliminating every single trace of her fingerprints. She meticulously sanitized the interior to ensure absolutely nothing traced back to her DNA. But then her cold, calculating mind realized a clean car was simply not enough. A clean car would still be traced back to its registered owner. The police would eventually come knocking on my door, and she knew I would tell them exactly who was driving the vehicle. She needed an airtight scapegoat to take the fall. She needed definitive, undeniable proof that I was the one behind the wheel during the collision. I could perfectly visualize her frantic, manicured hands tearing violently through my glove box. I could see her finding that small zippered pouch, tearing it open, and pulling out my spare driver license. She did not accidentally drop it in her frantic rush to escape the area. That was the desperate, hopeful lie my naive brain had initially tried to construct to protect my sanity. The devastating, brutal reality was that dropping the license was a conscious, deliberate, and deeply calculated act of pure malice. She walked back to the bloody scene or drove past it one last time, and intentionally tossed my identification onto the wet asphalt mere feet from the critically injured victim. She deliberately planted a massive flashing neon sign pointing law enforcement directly at my front door. She threw my entire existence into a roaring fire simply to ensure that the flames never touched her perfect life. My own sister sacrificed me to save herself, and my parents eagerly helped her strike the match. The cold of the concrete cell had completely seeped into my bones, turning my fingers completely numb. I had been sitting in that desolate, windowless room for what felt like an eternity, watching the shadows shift across the bleak floor. My mind kept violently replaying my mother's cold, indifferent voice over the phone, commanding me to take the fall for a crime I did not commit. I was entirely consumed by a dark, suffocating despair. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the blinding police lights and the barrel of the officer's gun pointed directly at my chest. I had accepted that my life was over. I assumed my parents had fully abandoned me to the legal system, leaving me to rot, while they shielded their precious golden child. Then the heavy steel door echoed with a sharp, loud clack. The heavy deadbolt turned, and the metal door swung open, groaning loudly on its hinges. A tired-looking corrections officer stood in the doorway holding a clipboard. He looked at me with a completely blank expression and told me to stand up. He said my bail had been posted, and I was free to go. My heart leaped into my throat. For one brief, foolish second, a desperate wave of hope washed over me. I actually thought my parents had experienced a sudden, miraculous change of heart. I thought the crushing guilt had finally overpowered their toxic devotion to my sister. I thought they were waiting for me at the front desk, ready to hug me and tell me it was all a terrible misunderstanding. I followed the officer down the long, winding corridor, my legs shaking so violently I could barely walk straight. I signed the release paperwork with trembling hands, retrieving my personal belongings in a foggy daze. I stepped through the heavy security doors into the harsh fluorescent light of the precinct lobby. I eagerly scanned the small waiting area looking for my mother or my father. But the lobby was completely empty, except for one solitary figure standing quietly by the front windows. It was not my parents. It was Marcus. Marcus is my brother-in-law. He is a brilliant African-American orthopedic surgeon at one of the most prestigious hospitals in Chicago. He is a man of profound, unshakable integrity, a man who spends his days putting broken people back together. He's deeply respected by everyone who knows him, carrying a commanding yet gentle presence that always makes you feel entirely safe. Marcus had married Blair 3 years ago, and I always wondered how a man with such a strong moral compass could fall for someone as deeply flawed and entitled as my sister. But Blair was a master manipulator. She played the perfect, loving wife flawlessly whenever Marcus was in the room, completely hiding her toxic, destructive habits behind designer clothes and a dazzling smile. Marcus stood there in the dreary police lobby, wearing a dark wool overcoat over his surgical scrubs. He looked physically exhausted. The deep lines around his eyes told me he had not slept a single minute. When he saw me standing there, shivering in my damp, wrinkled clothes, clutching my small plastic bag of personal items, his expression broke. There was no judgment in his dark eyes. There was no disgust or fear. There was only a profound, deep sorrow and an absolute simmering anger. He did not ask me if I was okay. He simply walked across the lobby, wrapped his strong arms around my freezing shoulders, and guided me gently toward the exit. We walked out into the freezing Chicago rain in total silence. The cold morning air hit my face, waking me up from the nightmare trance I had been trapped in all night. Marcus led me to his sleek black SUV parked near the edge of the lot. He opened the passenger door for me and waited until I was safely inside before walking around to the driver's side. The interior of the car was incredibly warm and smelled faintly of expensive leather and roasted coffee. It was a stark, shocking contrast to the smell of bleach and despair inside the holding cell. I sat frozen, staring blankly out the rain-streaked window, absolutely terrified to speak. My mind raced with panicked scenarios. Did Marcus believe the police? Did he think I was a reckless, violent criminal who had selfishly mowed down a pregnant woman and left her to die in the street? Was he just bailing me out of a misguided sense of family duty? I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for his anger and his inevitable questions. I prepared to fiercely defend my innocence, to beg him to believe that I had not driven my car that night. But as Marcus started the engine and pulled the heavy vehicle slowly out of the police parking lot, he did not yell. He did not demand an explanation or hurl accusations at me. He gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning slightly lighter as we drove through the quiet grey streets of the city. The silence stretched between us thick and heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that made the air in the cabin feel completely electrified. Finally, Marcus pulled the SUV over onto a quiet, empty side street. He shifted the car into park and turned to face me. He looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. "Harper, I know you did not do this," he said, his voice steady and vibrating with a quiet, furious, absolute certainty. I stared at him, my mouth dropping open in complete shock. I could not form a single word. The tears I had been desperately holding back suddenly flooded my eyes, blurring his face. "Blair came home shaking last night with a bruised shoulder smelling like vodka, and your parents rushed over to whisper in the kitchen." Marcus continued delivering the words like surgical strikes. What is going on? The sheer raw validation in his voice was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. I let out a loud, ragged sob, the heavy, agonizing weight of the entire night finally crashing down on my shoulders. I realized in that profound, life-altering moment that I was not completely alone. I had an ally. I had someone incredibly smart and resourceful who saw right through the poisonous illusion my biological family had constructed. I looked at Marcus, my voice trembling violently as I spoke. "I handed her my keys 3 days ago, Marcus." I sobbed the traumatic details, pouring out of me in a desperate, rushing wave. She told me her car was broken down completely. She told me she needed my car to go to a spa resort. I gave her the keys. My spare license was inside the glove box. She drove my car, and when she hit that poor woman, she planted my ID on the street so the police would arrest me instead of her. Marcus stared at me, his jaw clenching so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. A terrifying, absolute darkness washed over his features as the monstrous truth of his wife's actions finally clicked into place. The golden child illusion was completely broken, and the devastating counterattack had officially begun. The drive back to my apartment was wrapped in a heavy, suffocating silence. Marcus navigated the slick, rain-soaked streets of Chicago. while I stared out the passenger window, watching the blurry city lights bleed into the dark pavement. My mind was completely numb from the trauma of the gunpoint arrest and the holding cell, but a new, deeply unfamiliar emotion was slowly starting to thaw the ice in my veins. The raw, desperate panic of a betrayed daughter was systematically being replaced by the cold, calculating precision of a forensic accountant. We pulled into my apartment complex and Marcus walked me up to my door, staying close as if he was afraid my legs would completely give out. But my legs were not weak anymore. Every step I took up those stairs felt grounded, heavy, and driven by a singular, furious purpose. We stepped inside my modest living room. I did not bother turning on the main overhead lights. I walked straight into my home office and grabbed my heavy, encrypted work laptop off the desk. Marcus stood in the doorway of the office, his large frame filling the space, his dark eyes watching me with a mixture of deep concern and quiet solidarity. He took off his damp wool overcoat and draped it over a chair, waiting patiently for me to speak. I carried the laptop out to the kitchen island and set it down on the granite counter. My family had always viewed my career with profound indifference. To my mother and my father, I was just a boring number cruncher who sat behind a desk, completely lacking the vibrant social grace and high society appeal of my sister Blair. They truly believed I lived a dull, unremarkable life, driving a basic 10-year-old Honda Accord. But what my parents and my golden child sister completely failed to realize is that as a senior forensic accountant, I frequently audit massive multinational corporations. I regularly transport extremely sensitive, encrypted hard drives containing hundreds of millions of dollars of proprietary corporate financial data. Because of the highly classified nature of my corporate work, my firm mandates absolute extreme security protocols for all of my transportation. My boring, modest Honda Accord was not just a basic commuter car. 2 years ago, my firm professionally installed a concealed military-grade, dual-facing 4K dashcam directly into the housing of my rearview mirror. It is entirely invisible to anyone sitting inside the vehicle. It does not rely on a removable memory card that can be easily stolen or destroyed. The system is hardwired into the vehicle battery and maintains a continuous cellular connection, instantly uploading high-definition audio and video directly to a secure remote cloud server the very second the engine is turned on. They thought they had chosen the perfect disposable vehicle to commit a horrific felony and frame me. They had actually chosen a rolling surveillance vault that recorded their entire malicious conspiracy in perfect high definition. I sat down on the bar stool and opened the laptop screen. The soft blue light illuminated the dark kitchen. Marcus walked over and stood right behind my shoulder, his presence a solid, comforting anchor as I typed in my complex alphanumeric decryption password. The secure server portal loaded on the screen. My hands hovered over the keyboard. A tiny residual sliver of the daughter who just wanted her family to love her hesitated, terrified of hearing the absolute confirmation of their betrayal. But the woman who had been shoved against the hood of a police car with a gun aimed at her head fiercely pushed that weakness aside. I clicked on the video archive tab and filtered the extensive database by the exact date and time the police detective told me the horrific crash had occurred. Saturday afternoon, 3 days ago. A row of video thumbnails instantly populated the screen. I clicked on the file matching the exact timestamp of the accident. The video player buffered for a fraction of a second before the crystal-clear 4K footage completely filled the screen. The dual camera view was split cleanly down the middle, showing both the interior cabin of my car and the rainy exterior street view. There she was, Blair. My beautiful, privileged sister was sitting comfortably in my driver's seat. She was wearing an expensive white silk blouse and her signature oversized designer sunglasses. But the high-definition lens captured a terrifying reality that her carefully curated social media presence always hid. She was heavily, visibly intoxicated. Her movements were sloppy and erratic. She was aggressively swerving the steering wheel, crossing directly over the double yellow lines. She was singing loudly and slurring the lyrics to a pop song blaring on the radio. In the center console cup holder sat a stolen crystal glass, still half full of what looked like an orange mimosa from the exclusive country club she had been drinking at all afternoon. Marcus let out a sharp, heavy breath behind me, watching his wife drive with reckless, lethal abandon. I could feel the absolute disgust radiating from him. We watched in horrifying silence as the exterior camera showed the vehicle speeding aggressively down a quiet residential street, approaching a blind intersection. The traffic light ahead was clearly solid red. Blair did not even touch the brakes. She did not even look up. She reached down with her right hand, blindly searching for her phone in her designer purse, taking her eyes completely off the wet road. The impact happened in a fraction of a second, but watching it felt like an eternity. A woman holding a large shopping bag stepped into the crosswalk. She was clearly pregnant, her hand resting protectively on her swollen stomach. The front bumper of my car struck her with a violent, sickening thud. The high-definition microphone captured the horrific crunch of metal hitting bone. The woman was thrown violently onto the hood, her terrified face flashing briefly against the windshield, before she rolled off into the dark, wet street, disappearing from the camera view. Marcus gasped loudly, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter so tightly the granite seemed to groan. As an orthopedic surgeon who spent his life saving trauma victims, watching the brutal collision physically devastated him. Inside the cabin, the camera showed Blair slamming aggressively on the brakes, throwing her entire body forward against the seatbelt. My car skidded to a violent halt. Blair sat paralyzed, gripping the steering wheel as she stared out the windshield, her chest heaving with massive panicked breaths. She did not open the door. She did not jump out to render life-saving aid to the pregnant mother bleeding on the asphalt. She did not dial emergency services. Instead, her trembling, manicured fingers scrambled frantically across the digital display of her phone. She hit a speed dial contact and put the phone on speaker. The Bluetooth microphone in my car instantly picked up the ringing. "Hello, my mother." Susan answered, her voice completely normal and completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding. Mom Blair screamed hysterically, a shrill, piercing wail of pure selfish terror. "Mom, you have to help me. I hit someone. I hit a woman in the street. There is blood everywhere. I am so drunk, Mom. If the police come, they will arrest me. Marcus will divorce me. I will lose everything. My entire life will be completely ruined. You have to help me, please." Marcus stood completely rigid behind me, listening to his wife prioritize her lavish lifestyle and their marriage over the life of a dying pregnant woman. The silence on the other end of the phone call stretched for 3 excruciating seconds. I waited, holding my breath, to hear my mother tell her daughter to do the right thing. I waited to hear her tell Blair to call an ambulance and face the consequences of her reckless actions. Instead, my mother's voice came through the car speakers completely devoid of any shock or empathy. Her tone shifted instantly into cold, ruthless calculation. "Blair, listen to me very carefully." My mother commanded, her voice slicing through her daughter, hysterical sobbing. "You cannot go to prison. A felony driving under the influence charge will permanently destroy your marriage to Marcus and your standing in the community. Where are you right now? Whose car are you driving?" "I am in Harper's car." Blair sobbed frantically, looking around the dark, empty street. "I borrowed her stupid Honda this morning." "Perfect," my mother said. The sheer profound evil in that single word made my blood run entirely cold. It was the absolute confirmation of my total worthlessness to the woman who gave birth to me. "Listen to me, Blair. Open the glove box right now. Harper always keeps her spare driver license in a small zippered pouch with her vehicle registration. Find it right now." On the video, we watched Blair lean over and frantically tear into my glove box. She pulled out the small black leather pouch, unzipping it with shaking hands, and pulled out my plastic identification card. "I have it, Mum," she cried out, holding my face up to the camera lens. "I have her license. Now open your window." My mother ordered, her voice steady and terrifyingly calm. "Throw her license out onto the street right next to the body. You wipe down that steering wheel with your sleeve and you drive away right this second. Do not stop until you get back to her neighborhood." "Mom, what if they arrest Harper?" Blair asked, her voice trembling with a tiny fraction of hesitation. "Harper will be perfectly fine," my mother stated, absolutely dismissing my entire existence with a cold, ruthless efficiency. "She is tough, and she is single. She does not have a high-profile life to protect like you do. She can just take a plea deal and do a few years in a minimum security facility. She will figure it out. She always figures it out. Drop the license and drive away, Blair. Do it right now for the family." The video showed Blair rolling down the window without another word of protest. She tossed my driver license out into the freezing rain directly toward the bleeding victim. Then she grabbed the sleeve of her expensive silk blouse and furiously wiped down the steering wheel, the gear shift, and the door handles. She put the car into drive and slammed her foot on the accelerator, leaving the scene of the horrific crime. The video continued to run, showing the dark, empty streets as she drove away, but I reached out and closed the laptop screen. The sudden silence in my kitchen was absolutely deafening. I sat there staring at the blank metallic cover of my computer. The final remaining tether to my biological family had just been violently, completely severed. I looked up at Marcus. His eyes were wide, filled with an ocean of unspeakable horror and a quiet, towering rage. His wife, the woman he loved and slept next to, was a monster. And my parents were the architects of my destruction. We did not need to speak a single word to each other. We both knew exactly what had to be done next. They had ruthlessly thrown me into the fire to save themselves, but they had absolutely no idea they had just handed me the match. The digital weight of that dashcam footage was heavy enough to crush a normal person, but I was no longer a person driven by sentimentality. I was a forensic accountant, and my brain had shifted into a cold and analytical processing mode. The video was the foundation of my case, but I needed more. I needed to see the full scope of the conspiracy they had woven around my life while I was sitting in that freezing cell. I needed to know exactly how much my mother and father enjoyed the taste of my sacrifice. Marcus was standing beside my desk, his face etched with a level of agony I could barely witness. He had been married to Blair for 3 years, and in 1 hour his entire world had been revealed as a meticulously crafted lie. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers were steady, but his eyes were burning with a terrifying and absolute focus. "Harper," he said, his voice low and vibrating with a grim resolve. "Blair keeps her iPad synced to our home network. I set up a family sharing plan months ago, so we could manage our schedules. She never realized that I have full administrative access to every device in that house. I can see her messages in real time." He sat down at the small table and opened a specialized application. Within seconds, he had successfully mirrored the message feed from Blair's iPad. We sat in the dim light of my office, the only sound being the soft hum of my computer fan and the occasional rhythmic splash of rain against the window pane. A series of notifications began to populate the screen. My heart performed a violent lurch as I saw my mother's name appear at the top of the thread. The timestamp was current. They were talking right now. "Is she still at the precinct? Blair had messaged 10 minutes ago." My mother's response came back instantly. "Yes, your father heard from a contact that the detective is processing the paperwork for a felony hit and run. They found the ID exactly where you left it. Everything is moving forward just as we discussed." I watched the screen paralyzed. It is one thing to suspect a betrayal, but seeing the clinical and businesslike coordination of your own destruction is a different kind of trauma. Marcus gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. We continued to read as the conversation between my mother and his wife unfolded with a sickening and joyful energy. "I feel so much better now," Mom Blair wrote. "I was so worried about Marcus finding out, but he is still in Boston at his conference. He will not even be home until tomorrow. By then, Harper will be fully processed, and it will be her word against all that physical evidence." My mother sent a series of celebratory emojis. A bottle of champagne, a sparkling glass, a dancing woman. "We are literally opening a bottle of the good Veuve Clicquot right now, your father and I," she replied. "We are toasting to your future Blair. You have so much ahead of you, a career in high fashion and a husband who is a top surgeon. We could not let one reckless mistake take all of that away from you." I felt a wave of nausea so powerful I had to lean my head against the cool surface of the desk. Toasting. They were drinking expensive champagne to celebrate the fact that I was supposed to spend my 30s in a federal penitentiary. They were laughing while I was still smelling the bleach and the stale sweat of the holding cell. "Dad says to tell you that he is proud of how you handled yourself," my mother continued. "You were very brave to go back and fix the situation with the license. It was the only way to ensure the police would not look at your Audi or your bank records." Marcus let out a sharp and jagged breath. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of profound shame for his wife and a mounting and lethal protective instinct for me. "They are monsters, Harper," he whispered. "Pure, unadulterated monsters." We watched as a new message from Blair popped up on the screen. She had sent a photo. It was a selfie of her and my parents. They were in the living room of the house I paid for. My father was holding a crystal flute of champagne, and my mother was beaming with a wide and triumphant smile. Blair was in the center, her eyes bright, and her designer dress shimmering under the chandelier light. They looked like a family celebrating a lottery win or a wedding. They looked happy. "What about Harper, though?" Blair asked in the next message. "The guilt is starting to hit me a little bit. What if she gets a really long sentence? What if the woman she hit dies?" My mother's response was the final and absolute death of my relationship with my family. "Harper is built differently than you, Blair," she wrote with a cold and dismissive efficiency. "She has always been the strong one. She has no husband to lose and no social standing to protect. She will survive a few years in a minimum security facility. It will be like a long retreat for her. You, on the other hand, have a reputation to maintain. You are the face of this family." I closed my eyes as the words seared themselves into my memory. A long retreat. My life, my career, my freedom were nothing more than a minor inconvenience to them compared to the importance of Blair's reputation. I was the reliable workhorse, and workhorses are meant to be ridden until they can collapse. I looked at the photo of them again. They were standing on the expensive Persian rug I had bought them for their anniversary. They were surrounded by the luxury I had provided for them while they were actively plotting to steal the very air from my lungs. "Wait. There is more," Marcus said, pointing to a secondary group chat that had just become active. It included my father and an unknown number that Marcus quickly identified as a local high-end auto body shop owner. "Richard, the message from the shop owner read, 'The front end is finished. We replaced the bumper and the headlight housing with OEM parts. No one will ever be able to tell there was an impact. I am deleting the security footage from the garage now. Your wire transfer for $15,000 just cleared.' My father responded immediately. 'Thank you, Jim. You have no idea how much this means to our family. The car is being delivered back to Blair's garage as we speak. We owe you one.' Marcus looked at me, the horror in his eyes shifting into a sharp and surgical precision. 'They used your money to pay for the cover-up, Harper,' he said. 'That $15,000 came from the joint account you used to pay their bills. They literally used your own hard-earned savings to hire a criminal to raise the evidence of the crime they are blaming on you.' The layer of conflict was now so deep and so complex that it felt like a physical weight in the room. This was not just a hit and run anymore. This was felony obstruction of justice. This was identity theft. This was money laundering and witness tampering. They had created a massive and intricate web of criminality to protect one person, and they had done it with a level of arrogance that was truly staggering. I looked at Marcus, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel like the invisible sister. I felt like the smartest person in the room. "They think I am just a boring accountant," I said, my voice coming out like a razor blade. "They think I am just going to cry and beg for their help. They have no idea that I have already seen every message and every frame of that video." Marcus nodded slowly, his dark eyes reflecting the blue light of the iPad feed. "I am with you, Harper," he said firmly. "I am going to keep this feed active. I am going to record every single word they say. When we walk into that courtroom or that precinct, we are not going to just defend you. We are going to destroy them." The conversation on the screen began to wind down. My mother's final message of the night was the most chilling of all. "Get some sleep, Blair," she wrote. "Tomorrow you have your fitting for the gala. Harper will be fine. We will make sure she gets a public defender who knows how to keep things quiet. Everything is under control." I stared at the screen as the status indicator for my mother went offline. The silence in my apartment returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of a predator waiting in the tall grass. They were toasting to my downfall in a house I paid for with champagne bought with my money while they plotted to put me in a cage. They genuinely believed that 30 years of conditioning would keep me obedient. They believed that my need for their love would make me a willing martyr. I reached out and touched the cold glass of the laptop screen. I was a forensic accountant. I knew how to find what was hidden. I knew how to follow the trail of greed and ego until it led to the heart of the monster. And as I looked at Marcus, I knew that the golden child and her enablers were about to learn a very painful lesson about ROI. They had made a very bad investment in my silence, and now the bill was finally due. The silence in my apartment after closing the laptop was heavy and suffocating, like the air before a massive summer storm. Marcus sat perfectly still beside me, his large hands resting on the granite island and his dark eyes fixed on the blank metallic cover of my computer. The dual-facing 4K dashcam footage had provided the foundation of my case, but as a forensic accountant, I knew that evidence was only half of the battle. The video showed Blair driving the car and hitting that poor woman, but my family was already weaving a complex narrative of my mental instability to discredit anything I might say. They had planted my physical ID at the scene to create a direct link to the crime. If this went to trial, it would be my word against theirs, and they had been practicing their lies for 30 years. I needed something more than just a recording of their cruelty. I needed a digital fortress that no lie could ever penetrate. I needed an ironclad, impenetrable alibi. I looked at Marcus, and a cold, professional smile slowly spread across my face. It was the smile I wore when I found a hidden offshore account or a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. My family has always treated me like I was a boring, invisible calculator, Marcus. I said, my voice coming out as a sharp and steady whisper. They think I was just sitting in my office feeling lonely while Blair was out living her vibrant high society life. They genuinely believe I am disposable because they do not understand what I actually do for a living. I reached out and flipped the laptop screen back open. My fingers flew across the keyboard with a surgical precision. Marcus leaned in closer, watching as I bypassed my personal folders and accessed my encrypted corporate work server. At the exact timestamp of that horrific crash on Saturday afternoon, my family assumed I was just an easy target, but I was actually engaged in the single most important meeting of my career. I opened my corporate calendar and pulled up the metadata logs for Saturday. Take a look at this, I instructed, pointing to a 2-hour block of time, starting exactly 30 minutes before the accident and ending over an hour after Blair fled the scene. While my sister was day drinking at the country club and preparing to strike a pregnant pedestrian, I was leading a high-stakes recorded federal audit. I was in a mandatory virtual Zoom conference with a senior lead agent from the Internal Revenue Service. I clicked on the video archive for the meeting. Within seconds, a secondary video player appeared on my screen. It showed my home office in perfect detail. I was sitting at my desk wearing my professional glasses and a sharp blazer. On the other side of the split screen was Agent Miller, a federal officer with the IRS. The video captured our entire interaction in real time. We were discussing complex tax discrepancies for a multinational pharmaceutical firm. Every word we spoke was timestamped and watermarked by my firm's security software. The federal agent was literally looking at my face and speaking to me at the very moment the dashcam recorded the impact of my car block away. I am bulletproof, Marcus. I stated the words feeling like solid gold on my tongue. I was on a recorded federal call with a government agent for the entire duration of the crime. There is no judge or jury in this country who will believe I was behind the wheel of that car while I was simultaneously auditing a corporation for the IRS. The physical evidence they planted is now a massive neon sign pointing toward their own felony obstruction of justice. My driver license being at the scene despite my presence in this office proves it was planted with malicious intent. Marcus stared at the two screens, the dashcam footage on one side and the IRS audit on the other. He let out a long, slow breath that sounded like a weight being lifted from his soul. His expression shifted from profound grief to a sharp and lethal clarity. He was a surgeon, and he recognized that we were no longer just survivors of a family betrayal. We were the prosecutors. Harper, he said, his voice low and vibrating with a grim resolve. I have spent 3 years trying to ignore the red flags about Blair. I wanted to believe she was just impulsive or stressed, but seeing this, seeing how she and your parents were willing to let you rot in a cage to save her vanity is something I cannot ever unsee. He stood up and began pacing my kitchen, his medical training and logical mind already shifting into high gear. I have the resources. Harper, he continued, turning to look at me with a fierce protective energy. I have my own accounts, my own legal team, and a reputation in this city that they cannot touch. If they wanted to play a high-stakes game with your life, they picked the wrong targets. I am not just going to help you clear your name. I am going to help you burn their entire world to the ground. I leaned back in the bar stool, feeling a surge of raw power. I did not just want to clear my name anymore. Clearing my name was a mechanical necessity. What I truly wanted was total and absolute systemic karma. I wanted my mother to feel the same cold terror I felt when that gun was aimed at my head. I wanted my father to experience the financial ruin he was so eager to force upon me. And I wanted Blair, the golden child, who had been protected from every consequence since the day she was born, to finally face the full crushing weight of the law. We sat there for hours in the dim light of my office planning the anatomy of our counterstrike. Marcus explained that he could provide internal hospital records about the victim condition to ensure we knew exactly what charges Blair would be facing. He pledged to fund the most aggressive and ruthless criminal defense attorney in Chicago to oversee our strategy. We decided that we would not go to the police yet. If we handed over the evidence now, Blair might be able to negotiate a lesser charge by claiming she was scared. But if we let them continue their charade, if we let them lie to the detectives and sign false statements under oath, then they would be committing multiple counts of perjury and felony obstruction. They think they are the apex predators in this family, I said, looking at the metadata on my screen. They think they are the smart ones because they are loud and social. They forgot that I am the one who follows the paper trail for a living. I find the bodies buried in the spreadsheets. I am going to treat this betrayal like the ultimate corporate audit. I am going to find every lie, every wire transfer, and every whispered secret until there is nothing left of the Dixon family reputation but ash. Marcus nodded, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering blue light of the screens. They chose the wrong daughter to sacrifice Harper, he whispered. And they definitely chose the wrong man to lie to. We are going to wait until the gala. We are going to let them stand there in their designer clothes and their fake smiles while they think they have won. We are going to let them feel entirely safe. And then we are going to close the door and let the truth take everything from them. The layer of conflict was now so deep and so complex that it felt like a physical force in the room. This was no longer just about a hit and run. This was about a total and absolute dismantling of a toxic legacy. As a forensic accountant, I was used to looking for the return on investment. My parents and Blair had made a massive and horrific investment in my destruction, and I was going to make sure they paid back every single cent with interest. I looked at the digital clock on my wall. It was nearly 4 a.m. The sun would be coming up soon, and the first day of their downfall had officially begun. I was no longer a victim. I was the auditor of their souls, and the bill was finally due. The pale grey light of early morning slowly bled through the kitchen blinds, casting long cold shadows across the granite island where my encrypted laptop still hummed. The deep bone-chilling exhaustion that should have completely leveled me after spending the entire night in a freezing concrete holding cell was entirely gone. In its place was a sharp vibrating adrenaline that coursed through my veins like electricity. I stared at the dark metallic screen, knowing with absolute certainty that within its solid-state drive rested the complete and utter destruction of the family that had just tried to destroy me. Marcus sat quietly across from me, his large hands wrapped tightly around a mug of black coffee he had brewed while I secured the digital files. The heavy silence between us was no longer weighed down by the initial shock of betrayal. It had transformed into the precise, calculated silence of two people meticulously preparing for a massive war. He looked at me, his dark eyes utterly devoid of the gentle warmth he usually carried for his patients. He told me that for 3 entire years, he had dedicated his life and his heart to a woman he thought he knew. He told me, his voice dropping to a harsh, agonizing whisper, that he had unknowingly built a home with a remorseless monster, and he was absolutely not going to let that monster devour my life to save her own skin. He set his coffee mug down on the granite counter with a heavy thud and pulled his cell phone from his pocket. He did not call a sympathetic family friend or a standard corporate attorney to handle the situation quietly. He called a woman named Evelyn Vance. Evelyn Vance was a legendary criminal defense attorney in downtown Chicago. She was widely notorious in the elite legal circles for being an absolute ruthless shark, a brilliant tactician who systematically dismantled aggressive prosecutors and completely annihilated opposing counsel in the courtroom. Marcus knew her intimately because he had provided highly specialized expert medical testimony on one of her major high-profile personal injury cases several years ago. She was not the kind of soft-spoken lawyer you hired to negotiate a polite, quiet plea deal. She was the aggressive, unrelenting lawyer you hired when you wanted to scorch the earth and leave absolutely nothing standing. By 9 o'clock that morning, Marcus and I were sitting in the imposing waiting area of her downtown law firm. The environment was intentionally intimidating, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sweeping Chicago skyline and dark, heavy mahogany furniture that seemed to absorb the natural light. We were quickly ushered into her private office. Evelyn sat behind her massive immaculate desk, wearing a pristine tailored charcoal suit. Her sharp, calculating eyes assessed my wrinkled, damp clothes and my exhausted face with a cold, piercing intelligence. She did not offer me empty, patronizing sympathy or false maternal comfort. She simply steepled her manicured fingers, leaned forward, and asked me to lay out exactly what I had brought to her. I did not speak like a terrified victim desperately begging for a savior. I opened my encrypted laptop, placed it firmly on her desk, and spoke like the senior forensic accountant I had trained my entire life to be. I presented my case with absolute clinical surgical precision. First, I pulled up the secure cloud portal and showed her the dual-facing 4K dashcam footage captured from the concealed camera hardwired into my rearview mirror. The three of us sat in complete heavy silence as her high-definition external monitor displayed Blair, heavily intoxicated, striking the pregnant pedestrian with violent force. We watched the high-resolution video capture Blair deliberately tossing my spare driver license out of the window onto the bloody wet asphalt, explicitly planting the evidence. Next, I pulled up the cloned iPad message thread that Marcus had mirrored. I showed Evelyn the real-time digital text messages between Blair and my mother, exposing their active ongoing conspiracy to frame me for the violent crime. I pointed directly to the exact timestamp where my mother instructed Blair to leave my identification and run, stating callously that I could easily survive a few years in a minimum security prison because I had no valuable reputation or high society standing to maintain. Finally, I presented the ultimate ironclad defense. I showed Evelyn the certified Internal Revenue Service Zoom logs and the watermarked video recording of my federal audit. I proved beyond a shadow of a single legal doubt that I was actively leading a high-stakes corporate financial audit from my home office, interacting directly with a federal agent at the exact precise second my vehicle struck that poor woman several miles away. Evelyn leaned back slowly in her high-backed leather executive chair, her sharp eyes moving systematically between the dashcam footage, the text message logs, and the undeniable federal alibi. For a long, tense moment, the only sound in the massive office was the faint, rhythmic hum of the city traffic far below the glass windows. When she finally spoke, her voice was dangerously quiet and filled with a deep, predatory satisfaction. She told me that in her 30 years of practicing criminal law, she had never seen a client walk into her office carrying the absolute holy trinity of criminal defense. She told me I had provided her with the explicit motive, the undeniable recorded confession, and an impenetrable digital alibi that no prosecutor on earth could ever crack. She looked at Marcus and then directly at me, a slow, sharp smile lifting the corners of her mouth. She told us that if we stood up, walked down to the police precinct right this very second, and handed this laptop to the lead investigating detective, the nightmare would instantly end for me. The police would immediately review the footage, drop all pending felony charges against me, and send a squad car directly to Blair to make an arrest. But Evelyn raised a single finger, halting the sudden wave of relief that tried to wash over me. She warned us that turning over the evidence today would be a massive, catastrophic strategic mistake. She explained the harsh reality of the criminal justice system. If we handed over the evidence prematurely, Blair would immediately hire her own team of expensive, aggressive defense attorneys. Her lawyers would instantly advise her to play the victim card to the absolute maximum degree. She would claim she was in a state of profound medical shock after the collision. She would cry hysterically in front of a sympathetic judge, claiming she panicked in the dark rain and never truly meant to frame her sister, but was simply following bad advice from a terrified mother. With her clean criminal record, her wealthy husband, and her high society connections, a judge might easily offer her a generous, lenient plea deal for leaving the scene of an accident. She might serve a few short months in a comfortable facility, or even walk away entirely with probation and mandatory community service. She would survive, and my parents would continue to protect her. Evelyn leaned forward, resting her forearms firmly on the desk, her eyes locking onto mine with a fierce, burning intensity. She told us that we were absolutely not going to let that happen. She explained the brilliant, ruthless, and perfectly legal strategy we were going to employ instead. We were going to lock down the evidence and hold it completely tight. We were going to let the police department continue their active criminal investigation under the completely false assumption that I was the guilty party. We were going to allow my mother, my father, and my golden child sister to feel entirely safe, victorious, and completely untouchable. By holding our silence and enduring the temporary discomfort of being the prime suspect, we would force them to take the next inevitable, devastating step in their malicious conspiracy. Evelyn explained that the police would eventually call my family members in for formal questioning regarding the vehicle and the timeline of events. The detectives would ask Blair about borrowing the car. They would ask my parents about my erratic behavior and my whereabouts on the day of the crash. If they simply lied to the police during a casual phone call or a brief conversation at their front door, it was one thing, Evelyn explained. But if we let them confidently walk into a police precinct, voluntarily sit down inside an official interrogation room and sign formal sworn written statements, falsely accusing me of a violent felony under oath, they would cross a massive, irreversible legal threshold. They would be actively committing multiple severe counts of felony obstruction of justice, felony perjury, and criminal conspiracy to commit fraud. They would elevate a tragic hit and run accident into a massive coordinated criminal enterprise. Every single lie they put on the official police record, every false tear they shed for the detectives, every fabricated detail they provided to frame me would be another heavy iron nail hammered deeply into their respective coffins. We were going to hand them a shovel and stand back while they enthusiastically dug their own graves. I sat perfectly still in the leather guest chair, completely absorbing the sheer brilliant magnitude of the trap Evelyn was meticulously laying out before us. I thought about my mother gleefully celebrating with expensive champagne, while I sat shivering uncontrollably in a damp concrete cell. I thought about my father silently cowardly agreeing to throw my entire future and freedom away simply to protect the pristine family image. I thought about Blair intentionally tossing my identity onto the cold, wet street right next to a bleeding, dying woman without a single ounce of human empathy. They did not just want to escape the terrifying consequences of a terrible crime. They actively, enthusiastically wanted me to suffer the punishment in her place. The forensic accountant, deeply embedded inside my soul, instantly recognized the profound poetic symmetry of this legal plan. I was going to let them build an enormous, staggering mountain of debt in the form of sworn criminal lies. I was going to let their immense arrogance and their absolute unwavering certainty that I would always quietly take the fall be the very weapons that utterly destroyed them. Marcus reached over the armrest and gripped my hand tightly, his own dark resolve matching mine perfectly. His silent, unwavering support gave me the final push I needed to cross the threshold from victim to executioner. We looked at Evelyn Vance and officially agreed to the strategy. We were going to play the terrifying long game. We were going to walk back out into the world and pretend that I was completely broken, isolated, and terrified of the impending charges. We were going to let the golden child and her toxic enablers fully believe they had executed the perfect crime and won the ultimate victory over my life. And then when they were standing arrogantly at the very top of their fragile pedestal, believing they were completely untouchable, we were going to pull the floor out from beneath them and watch them fall. I sat alone in my kitchen as the pale dawnlight finally broke through the blinds, casting long grey shadows across the hardwood floor. Marcus had fallen asleep on my living room sofa, completely exhausted from the emotional toll of the night. But my mind was operating at a dangerous, hyper-vigilant frequency. Evelyn Vance, our new fiercely intimidating defense attorney, had explicitly instructed us to hold the dashcam and zoom evidence perfectly tight. She wanted us to wait for my parents and sister to formally lie to the police, thereby committing undeniable felony obstruction of justice. But the forensic accountant inside me, the woman who spent her entire adult life hunting down hidden assets and exposing corporate fraud, could not simply sit back and wait. I needed to see the complete financial anatomy of their betrayal. I needed to follow the paper trail because liars always make mistakes with money. I walked back into my home office and opened my personal laptop. The screen glowed to life, illuminating my tired face in the dark room. For 5 agonizing years, I had been the silent financial pillar, holding up my parents' fragile illusion of wealth. When my father impulsively retired early and their massive mortgage became an unbearable weight, I had foolishly opened a joint checking account with them. Every single month without fail, I deposited $3,000 of my own grueling corporate salary into that account just to keep a roof over their heads. I had viewed it as my dutiful obligation as a daughter. I had viewed it as the heavy recurring price I had to pay just to earn a tiny fraction of their approval. Now I viewed that account as a potential crime scene. My fingers flew across the keyboard typing in the secure banking portal address and my long complex password. The dashboard loaded instantly, displaying the current balance. My heart stuttered in my chest. The balance was completely wrong. It was nearly empty. I navigated directly to the recent transaction ledger, my eyes scanning the digital rows of black text with a practiced clinical detachment. There were the usual charges I had come to expect from their entitled lifestyle. A massive bill from the exclusive country club, an exorbitant charge at a high-end designer boutique downtown, a heavy tab at a luxury steakhouse, but right at the very top of the ledger, stamped with a date and time that made my blood run entirely cold, was a staggering anomaly. It was a massive, rapid wire transfer for exactly $15,000. The timestamp showed that the transaction had been initiated late Saturday night, just hours after Blair had ruthlessly struck that pregnant pedestrian with my car. The transfer had an incredibly steep expedited processing fee attached to it, ensuring the funds would clear immediately despite it being a weekend. People do not transfer $15,000 in the middle of the night for legitimate, innocent reasons. They do it when they are absolutely desperate and entirely panicked. They do it when they are trying to buy silence. A deep, sickening wave of rage washed over me, entirely eclipsing any lingering sorrow I felt for the loss of my family. They had not just plotted to frame me for a violent felony. They had literally used my own hard-earned life savings to finance the criminal cover-up. I stared at the generic alphanumeric code attached to the receiving bank account. To a normal person, it was just a random string of meaningless letters and numbers, deliberately designed to obscure the identity of the recipient. But I was not a normal person. I was a senior corporate auditor. I spent my days tearing apart shell companies and untangling massive webs of financial deceit. I opened a secondary secure window and logged into a specialized public records database I frequently used for corporate background checks. I cross-referenced the receiving bank routing number with state business registries. The initial search yielded a holding company with an incredibly vague, completely untraceable name: Apex Solutions LLC. It was a classic rudimentary diversion tactic. But whoever set up this limited liability company was careless. They had used a registered agent whose name I quickly traced through a network of local property tax records. My fingers hammered the keys, the mechanical clicking echoing loudly in the quiet house as I peeled back layer after layer of cheap corporate obfuscation. Within 20 minutes, I had completely unraveled the knot. The holding company was a recently acquired shell for a commercial property located deep in an isolated industrial park on the far south side of Chicago. I pulled up the commercial lease agreements and local business permits for that exact address. The name of the actual operating business flashed onto my screen in bold black letters. It was a high-end independent auto body shop, a shop owned and operated by a man named James Sullivan. The puzzle pieces violently slammed together in my mind, forming a picture so utterly monstrous it made my breath catch sharply in my throat. Jim. That was the name from the cloned text messages we had read earlier on Blair's iPad. My father had texted a man named Jim, thanking him for finishing the front end and deleting the security footage. The entire horrifying scope of their trap was now completely undeniably clear. When Blair drunkenly slammed my modest Honda Accord into that pregnant woman, the physical impact would have been catastrophic to the vehicle. The front bumper would have been heavily dented. The headlight assembly would have been shattered. The hood would have been severely damaged and undoubtedly coated in physical forensic evidence matching the victim. If the police had simply found my car parked on the street with that massive obvious damage, I could have easily demanded a forensic sweep of the interior cabin. The detectives would have found Blair DNA all over the driver's side airbag, the steering wheel, and the gear shift. They would have known instantly that I was not the person behind the wheel. My mother and father knew this. They knew that physical damage to the car would eventually lead the investigators to ask the wrong questions. So they did not just tell Blair to wipe down the steering wheel and drop my driver license in the street. They orchestrated a comprehensive elite criminal cover-up. They instructed Blair to drive my damaged vehicle directly to this off-the-books auto body shop in the dead of night. They paid Jim, the mechanic, $15,000 in stolen cash to ask absolutely no questions. They paid him to immediately pull my car into a hidden bay, furiously rip off the damaged bumper, completely replace the shattered headlight housing, and aggressively sanitize the entire exterior of the vehicle. They forced him to work through the night to make my car look absolutely pristine and entirely untouched. And once the physical evidence of the brutal collision was completely erased, they had the mechanic quietly drive my vehicle back into the city and park it on a dark residential street just a few blocks away from my apartment building. They meticulously engineered the perfect crime scene. When the police finally located my vehicle, they would find a perfectly intact car parked near my home. The only physical evidence tying the vehicle to the horrific hit and run would be the spare driver license Blair had deliberately dropped next to the bleeding victim. It was a masterclass in framing an innocent person. It was ruthless, calculated, and executed with a level of cold-blooded precision that truly terrified me. They had covered every single base. They had erased every single flaw in their narrative. They had constructed a flawless, inescapable cage around me, and they had used my own money to buy the heavy iron locks. I sat staring at the glowing screen, my hands trembling with the fear's consuming energy. The sheer audacity of their greed was staggering. They had robbed me blind to pay for my own destruction. But their flawless plan contained one massive fatal flaw. They fundamentally underestimated me. They had spent my entire life treating me like an invisible, obedient servant, completely dismissing my intelligence and my capabilities. They truly believed I would just blindly panic and surrender. They had no idea that their obedient scapegoat possessed the exact specific skills required to absolutely dismantle their lives. I printed every single document I had just uncovered. I printed the bank ledger showing the rapid, unauthorized wire transfer. I printed the property records, the LLC registration, and the business license connecting the transaction directly to the auto body shop. I gathered the massive stack of paper, physical, undeniable proof of their felony obstruction and money laundering, and placed it securely in a thick manila folder next to my encrypted laptop. I walked into the living room where Marcus was just starting to wake up, rubbing his tired eyes. I handed him the folder and watched his expression shift from exhaustion to absolute stunned horror as he reviewed the financial documents. He looked at me, his face hardening into a mask of grim determination. He realized exactly what I had done. I had not just found the murder weapon. I had found the receipts for the bullets. We were completely armed. We were armed with the dashcam footage, the IRS Zoom audit logs, and the undeniable financial proof of a massive criminal cover-up. The trap was fully set, and all we had to do now was wait for them to arrogantly, blindly step right into it. Evelyn Vance, our fiercely intimidating defense attorney, had given us our marching orders, and now we had to play the hardest, most agonizing game of our entire lives. We had to embrace the strategic silence. I had to stay locked inside my apartment, pretending to be the broken, isolated, and terrified sister, while Marcus had an arguably much harder and far more psychologically damaging task. He had to drive back to his massive custom-built home in the affluent suburbs and sleep next to an absolute monster. He had to kiss the cheek of the woman who had just ruthlessly plotted to destroy an innocent life simply to save her own designer skin. Marcus was a highly meticulous orthopedic surgeon who spent his days repairing shattered spines and complex fractures. He treated this monumental family betrayal exactly like a delicate, high-stakes surgical procedure. He knew that one wrong move, one sudden outburst of anger, would cause the entire operation to hemorrhage and fail. Before he even stepped foot back into his house to face Blair, he made a critical, hidden detour. He did not go to a standard family lawyer to discuss a polite separation. He went to a brutal, high-end divorce attorney who specialized in systematically dismantling predatory spouses and protecting generational wealth. Behind the scenes, completely invisible to Blair and her raging narcissism, Marcus initiated a quiet, merciless divorce process. He owned the sprawling suburban house long before they were married, and his immense family wealth was strictly tied up in an ironclad generational trust. Blair had spent the last 3 years of their marriage slowly and deliberately trying to weave her name into his financial foundation, constantly pushing to commingle their assets. She loved bragging to her country club friends about his money, treating his bank accounts like her personal infinite money tree. But Marcus was brilliant, and he moved with lethal silent speed. Working with his legal team, he silently froze all of his personal liquid assets. He drastically restricted the credit limits on the platinum cards she used to fund her lavish lifestyle, masking the restrictions as a temporary bank security measure. Most importantly, he legally and permanently severed her access to his family trust, effectively locking her out of the millions she thought she was entitled to. He built an impenetrable financial fortress overnight, leaving her completely stranded outside the heavy iron gates without her ever realizing that the locks had been permanently changed. When Marcus finally returned home late that Sunday evening from his supposed medical conference in Boston, he played the role of the exhausted but devoted husband with an absolute flawless chilling perfection. He walked through the grand double doors of their foyer, dropped his heavy leather travel bag, and let Blair wrap her arms around him. He told me later that feeling her hands on his neck made his skin physically crawl and his stomach violently turn. But he forced his jaw to relax, and he forced himself to smile. He stood in their pristine designer kitchen and listened attentively as she fed him a highly sanitized, entirely fabricated version of her weekend. She told him a deeply tragic story about how her erratic, jealous sister had foolishly driven her car while under immense stress and had gotten into a terrible accident downtown. She actually managed to cry fake, glistening tears for him, burying her face in his chest and whispering how sick with worry she was about me. She played the role of the concerned, loving sibling to absolute perfection. Marcus gently stroked her blonde hair and told her exactly what she needed to hear to feel entirely safe. He validated her fabricated trauma. He played the supportive anchor, assuring her that my unfortunate legal troubles would absolutely not be allowed to affect their perfect, beautiful life together. His ability to compartmentalize his profound disgust and play the long game was truly staggering. But Marcus was not just playing a compliant role to keep the peace. He was actively gathering devastating ammunition. Using his own personal resources, he purchased several tiny high-definition voice-activated recording devices. He strategically and carefully placed them in key, highly trafficked locations around their massive home. He hid one completely out of sight beneath the center console of her newly repaired luxury SUV. He tucked another tiny microphone deep inside the elaborate, expensive floral arrangement sitting on the marble kitchen island. He placed a third device inside her massive custom walk-in closet, where she frequently took private, hushed phone calls from our mother. The golden child and our toxic, enabling parents were so deeply intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance that they became incredibly sloppy. They truly believed they had executed the perfect crime by planting my driver license and paying off the shady mechanic. Their staggering arrogance made them entirely reckless with their words. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus would discreetly leave his house and meet me in my secure home office, and we would plug the tiny memory cards into my encrypted laptop. Sitting there listening to those retrieved audio files was a masterclass in psychological horror and family betrayal. I heard the crisp, high-quality audio of my sister casually pouring a glass of wine in her kitchen while talking to my mother on speakerphone. She was not expressing a single ounce of remorse for the pregnant woman she had violently struck with my car. She was actively, enthusiastically bragging about how smart they were. I heard Blair laughing, a sharp, cruel sound that made the blood in my veins run completely cold. She actually mocked me to my own mother. She said Harper is probably just sitting in her depressing little apartment crying over public defender fees right now. She told my mother that I was so incredibly predictable and pathetic. She boasted that I would just quietly take whatever terrible plea deal the prosecutor offered because I was too terrified and weak to fight back against the police. I sat frozen, staring at my computer screen as I heard my mother chime in on the recording, completely validating her cruelty. My mother told Blair that this was exactly why I was the perfect family scapegoat. My mother said she's used to taking the hit, Blair. It is practically what she was born for. She told her golden child to just focus on her upcoming charity gala and to not let my little legal drama ruin her positive mood. I listened as Blair complained to my father about the temporary inconvenience of having to drive a rental car while her Audi was in the shop pretending to her friends it was for routine high-end maintenance. I heard my father reassuring her with a disgusting warmth in his voice that Jim the mechanic had done a flawless job covering up the front-end damage, and that absolutely no one would ever suspect a single thing. They were treating my entire existence, my freedom, and my future like a minor temporary speed bump on their road to high society glory. Every single recording Marcus captured and played for me was a sharp, jagged knife twisting violently into my back. But instead of bleeding out, I found myself growing exponentially stronger. Every cruel laugh, every arrogant brag, every dismissive, toxic comment about my life simply added another thick layer of impenetrable armor to my soul. They thought I was weak. They thought I was broken and blindly obedient. They had absolutely no idea that every time they opened their mouths to celebrate my destruction, they were willingly handing me the exact specific tools I needed to completely annihilate them. The strategic silence we were maintaining was absolute torture. It took every ounce of restraint I possessed not to drive over to their house and scream the truth into their faces. But I knew that silence was the most lethal weapon we had. The trap was growing tighter and tighter with every passing day, and they were happily, arrogantly dancing right in the center of it, completely blind to the massive executioner blade hanging directly over their heads. I was meticulously cataloging every single audio file, matching their recorded lies against the physical evidence of the dashcam and the IRS Zoom logs. I was building an airtight, inescapable vault of criminal evidence. Marcus would sit across from me, his face a mask of cold fury, organizing the financial documents, proving my parents had used my own money to pay the crooked mechanic. We were a two-person army operating entirely in the shadows. We were patiently allowing the golden child to dig a hole so incredibly deep that she would never ever see the sun again. And as I listened to my mother laugh on that recording celebrating my impending prison sentence, I made a silent vow that when the time finally came to drop the hammer, I would not show them a single shred of the mercy they had denied me. The days following our visit to Evelyn Vance were a masterclass in psychological warfare. I had to suppress every instinct that screamed at me to expose them and instead inhabit the fragile, terrified shell of a woman completely broken by the legal system. The physical toll of the charade was exhausting. I stopped wearing makeup. I barely slept naturally, allowing deep dark circles to form under my eyes. I wore the same oversized gray sweater for 3 days straight, deliberately projecting an image of absolute crushing despair. When I finally felt I looked the part of the perfect sacrificial lamb, I picked up my phone and sent a desperate pleading text message to the family group chat. I asked them to come to my apartment for an emergency family crisis meeting. I told them the police had just formally questioned me and I was completely terrified. They arrived precisely on time, masking their lethal intentions behind perfectly practiced expressions of profound parental concern. My father, Richard, walked through my front door wearing his casual weekend golf attire, looking for all the world like a man burdened by an unfortunate family tragedy. My mother, Susan, trailed close behind, carrying a plastic container of homemade lasagna, the ultimate suburban prop of false maternal care. Blair floated in last, her perfectly manicured hands clutching her designer handbag. She had completely dropped her country club glamour, opting instead for a subdued dark blue dress, attempting to look appropriately mournful for her sister impending incarceration. They sat down on my living room sofa, positioning themselves as a united supportive front, while I paced nervously in front of the television, my hands physically shaking. I did not have to fake the tremor in my hands. The pure, unadulterated adrenaline flooding my system was completely real. I was standing in my own living room, looking at the 3 people who were actively conspiring to destroy my entire existence. I took a deep, shaky breath and launched into the performance of a lifetime. I told them the detective had aggressively interrogated me for hours, threatening me with severe mandatory prison time. I forced genuine tears into my eyes, sobbing loudly about how terrified I was of losing my career, my apartment, and my freedom. I painted a picture of utter devastation, telling them I felt completely trapped and entirely alone. Blair was the first to speak. She stood up, walked over, and wrapped her arms tightly around my shoulders. "Harper," she whispered, her voice dripping with artificial syrupy sympathy. "I am so incredibly sorry you are going through this absolute nightmare. We are your family, and we are right here for you. We love you so much. Feeling her hands on me, the same hands that had wiped down my steering wheel and tossed my identification into the street next to a bleeding woman, made me want to physically vomit. I leaned into her embrace, forcing myself to return the hug, playing the role of the desperate clinging sister seeking comfort from her executioner. I pulled away, wiping my eyes with the sleeve of my sweater, and looked directly at my father. "Dad!" I begged, my voice cracking perfectly. "I need a real lawyer. The public defender the court assigned me is completely overwhelmed. They told me I could face 5 to 10 years if this goes to trial. I need to hire a private defense attorney, but I simply do not have the liquid cash right now. I need your help. I need a loan to cover the retainer. Please, Dad. I will pay you back every single cent." The silence that fell over my living room was thick and absolute. My father shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, avoiding my desperate gaze. He looked at my mother, a silent, entirely calculated communication passing instantly between them. My mother gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, giving him the green light to drop the hammer. My father sighed heavily, rubbing his hands over his face, performing the role of the defeated, overwhelmed patriarch. "Harper," he began, his voice heavy with false regret. "You know how incredibly tight things have been since my retirement. The stock market has been completely volatile, and our liquid assets are entirely tied up in restrictive long-term investments." He looked me dead in the eyes, his expression a mask of manufactured sorrow. "We simply do not have a dime to spare right now, Harper. I am so sorry, but we cannot help you with a private attorney." I stared at him, letting my jaw drop open in perfect theatrical shock. "I am begging you, Dad," I cried out, dropping to my knees on the living room rug. "Please, you have the equity in the house. You can take out a line of credit. I cannot go to prison for this." "You are being completely unreasonable, Harper." My mother snapped her tone, shifting instantly from false sympathy to harsh parental authority. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits. "We are absolutely not risking our financial security or our home for this. You need to be pragmatic and face the reality of the situation." "But I am innocent," I pleaded, looking wildly between them. "The police have it all wrong. Someone else must have stolen my car." My mother let out a sharp, dismissive sigh, completely cutting off my desperate defense. "Harper, stop it! She commanded, her voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. "The police found your driver license at the scene. They matched the paint from the victim directly to your vehicle registration. Your fingerprints are completely absent from the steering wheel, which they view as a deliberate attempt to cover up the crime. You have no alibi and no witnesses. The physical evidence is completely overwhelming, and fighting this in court will only enrage the prosecuting attorney." She paused, letting the devastating weight of her fabricated narrative settle heavily into the room. She was systematically detailing the exact trap she had built for me, using the very evidence she had instructed Blair to plant as the reason I had to surrender. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation and pure narcissistic evil. "You need to listen to your public defender, Harper," she continued, her voice cold and absolute. "You need to take the plea deal. They will offer you a much lighter sentence if you simply admit guilt and save the county the expense of a massive trial. You are strong. You are resilient. You can survive a few years in a minimum security facility. If you drag this out into a massive, highly publicized trial, you will permanently ruin the family name. Blair's husband, Marcus, relies heavily on his pristine public reputation to secure hospital funding. Do not be selfish, Harper. Just plead guilty and take the deal. Do it for the family." I stayed on my knees, looking up at the people who had brought me into this world. They were literally asking me to throw my entire life into an incinerator simply to keep them warm. They were commanding me to accept a felony conviction to protect Blair's country club status. I let out one final ragged sob, burying my face in my hands. "Okay." I whispered the word muffled and utterly defeated. "Okay, if that is what I have to do." My father let out a massive audible sigh of relief. My mother leaned back against the sofa, her posture instantly relaxing as the tension left her body. Blair knelt down beside me, wrapping her arms around me again, shedding more fake, glistening tears onto my shoulder. "You are so brave, Harper," she whispered into my ear. "You are saving this family. I will never ever forget what you are doing for me." They stayed for another 20 minutes, offering me empty, hollow platitudes about how quickly the time in prison would pass and promising to visit me on weekends. When they finally walked out my front door, they looked completely victorious. They walked down the hallway, chatting lightly about where to grab lunch. On the way back to the suburbs, their massive burden entirely lifted. I closed the front door and locked the deadbolt. The second the heavy metallic click echoed through the quiet apartment, my entire demeanor completely transformed. The tears stopped instantly. The shaking in my hands vanished, replaced by an absolute chilling calm. I walked back into my home office and reached beneath the heavy stack of corporate financial binders sitting on the bottom shelf of my bookcase. I pulled out my phone and hit the stop button on the digital voice recording application. Evelyn Vance, our brilliant, ruthless defense attorney, had explicitly instructed me not to confront them. She had told me to gather undeniable, explicit proof of their criminal conspiracy. As a forensic accountant, I knew that the best way to catch a fraudster was to let them believe their lies were completely believed. I had just recorded 30 entire minutes of my mother, father, and sister actively conspiring to force me into a false confession. I had captured my father explicitly lying about their financial situation to deny me legal representation while completely ignoring the $15,000 they had just wired to a corrupt mechanic to fix the murder weapon. I had recorded my mother aggressively pressuring me to take a plea deal, explicitly stating that I needed to do it to protect Blair's reputation. I plugged the phone into my encrypted laptop and securely uploaded the massive audio file directly to Evelyn's private server. I listened to the playback, my mother cold-calculated voice echoing through the quiet office telling me to go to prison for the family. The Golden Child and her enablers had just provided the final absolute piece of ammunition we needed to completely annihilate them. The trap was now officially fully set, locked and loaded with high-definition video federal audit logs and a recorded criminal confession. All that was left to do was wait for the grand finale and pull the trigger. The annual pediatric charity gala at the Drake Hotel was the undisputed crown jewel of the Chicago High Society social calendar. It was a night of pure, unadulterated opulence, designed specifically for the city elite to showcase their immense wealth under the protective guise of philanthropy. The grand ballroom was a masterpiece of gilded architecture, featuring massive crystal chandeliers that cascaded brilliant light over tables draped in heavy white silk. A live string quartet played soft classical music in the corner, providing the perfect, elegant soundtrack for the evening. For my sister Blair, this was not just a charity event. This was her personal coronation. Because her husband Marcus was one of the most brilliant and respected orthopedic surgeons at the hospital, Blair was granted the ultimate stage to perform her favorite role. She got to play the flawless, devoted, and infinitely glamorous surgeon wife. From the shadows of the grand foyer, I stood perfectly still and watched them through the slightly parted mahogany doors. My forensic accountant brain automatically calculated the sheer cost of the arrogant display in front of me. Blair was holding court near the center of the room, surrounded by a cluster of wealthy hospital board members and prominent local politicians. She was wearing a custom $5,000 emerald green designer gown that hugged her figure perfectly. Her blonde hair was swept up in an intricate, elegant style, and expensive diamond drop earrings glittered every time she threw her head back to laugh at someone's joke. She looked absolutely radiant. She looked perfectly, entirely at peace. There was not a single trace of guilt or hesitation in her bright, sparkling eyes. Looking at her, you would absolutely never guess that just a few short weeks ago, she had drunkenly driven my car into a pregnant woman, wiped her fingerprints off the steering wheel, and tossed my driver license into the freezing rain to frame me for a violent felony. She was drinking top-shelf champagne and soaking up the adoration of the room, completely convinced that she had successfully fed me to the wolves. My parents were standing right beside her, basking aggressively in the reflected glow of her stolen spotlight. My father, Richard, was wearing a sharp-rented tuxedo, holding a crystal glass of bourbon and nodding vigorously at a story being told by a hospital administrator. My mother, Susan, looked incredibly smug in a dark velvet evening gown, completely in her element as she rubbed elbows with Chicago elite. They were smiling and clinking glasses, projecting the image of the perfect, proud American family. They looked incredibly safe. They genuinely believed that their massive criminal conspiracy had worked flawlessly. They thought I was sitting alone in my dark, depressing apartment, completely crushed by the weight of their manipulation, terrified of the police, and quietly preparing to take a devastating plea deal, just like they had commanded me to do. They thought they had successfully purchased this luxurious, glamorous reality using my freedom and my future as currency. They had absolutely no idea that their golden carriage was about to turn into a pumpkin. I turned away from the crack in the heavy doors and looked at the three people standing silently beside me in the grand foyer. I was not wearing a cheap clearance rack dress to blend into the background tonight. I was not making myself small or invisible. I was wearing a stunning razor-sharp, custom-tailored midnight blue power suit that fit me like absolute armor. My hair was sleek and straight, and I wore a dark, bold lipstick. I looked exactly like what I was. A senior corporate auditor who had just uncovered a massive catastrophic fraud and was walking into the boardroom to liquidate the entire company. Standing directly to my right was Evelyn Vance. The legendary defense attorney looked like a lethal weapon wrapped in a designer charcoal blazer. She carried a sleek black leather briefcase that contained the cloned iPad message logs, the IRS audit timestamps, and the high-definition dashcam footage. Behind us stood two tall, broad-shouldered plainclothes police detectives. Evelyn had bypassed the local precinct entirely and taken our ironclad mountain of evidence directly to a senior contact at the district attorney office. When the prosecutors saw the crystal-clear video of Blair fleeing the scene and read the text messages of my mother orchestrating the cover-up, they did not just drop my charges. They immediately issued highly classified felony arrest warrants for Blair, Richard, and Susan. Are you ready? Harper, Evelyn asked, her voice a low, calm murmur that echoed slightly in the marble foyer. I took one final deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool, conditioned air. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had drained from my own savings to pay my parents' mortgage. I thought about the freezing holding cell and the terrifying metallic click of the police handcuffs. I thought about my mother telling Blair that I could easily survive a few years in a minimum security prison because I had no reputation to protect. The last lingering shred of my lifelong, desperate need for their love completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a cold, hardened foundation of pure justice. I am completely ready, I replied. Evelyn nodded to the detectives. I reached out, placed my hands flat against the heavy mahogany doors and pushed them wide open. The heavy doors swung inward with a loud, echoing thud that instantly cut through the polite murmurs and the soft classical music of the ballroom. I stepped through the threshold, my heels clicking sharply and rhythmically against the polished marble floor. Evelyn walked perfectly in step beside me, and the two imposing detectives followed closely behind, forming an undeniable wedge of severe legal authority. We did not hesitate or look around. We walked with a slow, deliberate, and terrifying purpose directly toward the center of the room. The shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous and palpable. It started near the back of the room as guests turned to see what was causing the disruption. The sight of a woman in a stark tailored power suit, flanked by two obvious law enforcement officers slicing through a sea of colorful ball gowns, was incredibly jarring. Conversations began to violently stutter and die. The polite laughter faded into confused, strained whispers. The ripple of heavy, suffocating tension spread rapidly across the massive ballroom until it reached the string quartet in the corner. The musicians, sensing the severe drop in the room energy, faltered entirely, and the classical music awkwardly ground to a complete halt. The sudden oppressive silence in the room finally caused Blair to turn her head. She was mid-laugh, holding her champagne flute elegantly near her collarbone when her eyes locked onto mine. I watched the profound physical transformation hit her like a violent electric shock. The bright, arrogant smile on her face did not just fade. It instantly, completely evaporated. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her pale and hollow. Her hand began to tremble so violently that the expensive champagne splashed over the rim of her crystal flute, spilling onto the floor. My mother and father noticed her sudden paralysis and followed her terrified gaze. When my parents saw me striding toward them, flanked by police detectives, their confident high society masks shattered into a million jagged pieces. My father took a sudden, involuntary step backward, nearly bumping into a hospital donor. My mother's mouth fell open in an ugly, silent gasp of pure, unadulterated horror. They were looking at the obedient, reliable scapegoat they had comfortably thrown to the wolves, but the woman walking toward them was holding the leash. Marcus was standing near the edge of the stage, speaking with the chief of surgery. He saw me enter, and a dark, grim look of absolute satisfaction settled over his features. He subtly stepped back, completely separating himself from his wife and her family, intentionally clearing the path for the executioner. I stopped exactly 5 feet away from my sister. The entire ballroom was dead silent, watching the confrontation unfold with breathless anticipation. Blair opened her trembling mouth, attempting to quickly assemble her usual flawless mask of innocent charm, but her voice completely failed her. She looked at Evelyn Vance. She looked at the heavy gold badges currently clipped to the belts of the 2 stern detectives. And finally, she looked back at me, her eyes wide, with the sudden, terrifying realization that the trap she had built for me had just violently snapped shut on her own neck. I stood incredibly tall, my shoulders back, completely immune to her panic. The golden child was finally completely out of time. The entire ballroom was frozen in a state of suspended animation. The clinking of crystal champagne glasses had ceased completely, and the only sound was the sharp collective intake of breath from the elite crowd as they stared at me and the 2 plainclothes detectives. I watched Blair physically shrink, her perfect posture crumbling as the reality of my presence began to suffocate her. But before she could even attempt to utter a single lie or rush forward to create a dramatic scene, Marcus moved. He did not look at his wife. He simply turned and walked with a slow, deliberate cadence up the short staircase to the main stage. The stage was framed by massive floral arrangements and flanked by 2 enormous digital projection screens that had been displaying the hospital charity logo all evening. He stepped up to the microphone. The screech of audio feedback briefly pierced the heavy silence, making several wealthy guests flinch in their seats. Marcus gripped the edges of the heavy wooden podium, his knuckles turning white under the glaring stage lights. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice echoing through the massive cavernous space with a deep, resonant authority. "I want to thank all of you for being here tonight to support the pediatric wing. We gather at these exclusive events to celebrate healing and to honor the sacred trust placed in us as medical professionals. We take a solemn oath to do no harm and to protect the vulnerable. We build our lives and our reputations on a foundation of absolute trust and unwavering accountability." He paused, letting his heavy words hang in the still air. The hospital board members and affluent donors nodded along, assuming this was a standard, passionate charity address. But then Marcus lowered his head slightly, and his voice dropped to a cold, lethal register that sent a visible shiver through the room. "But accountability," he continued, "is not just a professional medical obligation. It is a moral imperative. And tonight, I have learned that the very foundation of my own home was built on a staggering, profound, and violent lie. I have spent my entire surgical career putting broken people back together, but tonight, I must expose the people who intentionally break others for their own selfish gain." He lifted his hand, slowly extending his arm out toward the center of the ballroom. His finger pointed directly and unwaveringly at Blair. The elegant crowd physically parted around her, instinctively stepping away from the sudden direct accusation. Blair let out a pathetic, whimpering gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked around frantically, her eyes wide and panicked, searching for a friendly face, a sympathetic gaze, an escape route. There was absolutely none. Marcus stared down at her from the stage, his expression completely devoid of any love or warmth. He looked at the woman he had married with nothing but pure, unadulterated disgust. This was my cue. I stepped forward, leaving Evelyn Vance and the detectives near the entrance, and walked directly toward my parents. The sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos parted for me just as they had for Blair, their eyes tracking my every single movement. I carried the thick, heavy manila folder in my left hand. My father, Richard, was breathing heavily, his face flushed a dark, mottled red. He tried to puff out his chest and project his usual arrogant authority, but his eyes were darting nervously like a trapped, desperate animal. I stopped barely 2 feet away from him. The scent of his expensive bourbon and my mother's heavy perfume was nauseating. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or cry or perform for the crowd like they always did. I looked him dead in the eye and held out the folder. He hesitated for a long, agonizing second before his trembling hands reached out to take it. "Open it!" I commanded, my voice dropping to a harsh, icy whisper that only he and my mother could hear. "Read exactly what your pristine family reputation is actually worth, Dad." He fumbled with the metal clasp, his fingers clumsy and slick with cold sweat. He flipped the folder open, and the thick stack of financial and legal documents was finally exposed to the harsh ballroom light. The very first page was the certified bank ledger. I watched his eyes track across the numbers. I watched the exact moment his brain processed the rapid $15,000 wire transfer originating from the joint account I had used to fund his lavish lifestyle. His breath hitched audibly. He quickly flipped to the next page, revealing the corporate registry and the business license of the off-the-books auto body shop located on the south side. The shop owned by his mechanic friend, Jim. The shop where they had paid stolen cash to repair the front end of my car and destroy physical criminal evidence. I leaned in slightly, my voice steady and completely relentless. "Did you honestly think I would not notice my own money missing?" I whispered. "Did you genuinely believe the forensic accountant you treated like a disposable servant would not immediately track a midnight wire transfer to a corrupt mechanic?" He swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the quiet space, and turned to the third document. It was the official federal watermarked log from the Internal Revenue Service, verifying my continuous active presence on a highly secure video audit during the exact time frame of the accident. I watched my father's entire reality completely disintegrate. The arrogant, confident patriarch who had cruelly told me just a few days ago that he had absolutely no money to help me hire a lawyer and that I should plead guilty to save the family was now staring at absolute undeniable proof of his own incoming felony conviction. His hands began to shake so violently that the papers rattled loudly against the cardboard folder. My mother leaned over his shoulder, straining to see what was causing his profound panic. When she saw the bank records and the federal logs, she let out a sharp, strangled cry, clutching her chest, as if she had been physically struck. Up on the stage, Marcus did not wait for my parents to recover from their shock. He turned his head and gave a sharp, definitive nod to the audiovisual technicians stationed in the elevated booth at the back of the room. The massive digital screens flanking the stage suddenly flickered completely black. The hospital charity logos vanished entirely. The ballroom plunged into a dimmer, more ominous light. And then the giant screens exploded with bright, jarring, high-definition video. It was the dual-facing dashcam footage from my car. Because the screens were massive, the image was completely inescapable. Every single wealthy donor, every hospital executive, every local politician, and every high society socialite in the room was suddenly forced to watch the violent crime unfold in massive cinematic detail. The audio kicked in loud and terrifyingly clear, perfectly synced through the state-of-the-art ballroom speakers. The sound of the torrential rain beating against the windshield filled the expansive room. Then the camera angle displayed the interior cabin. Their projected 30 feet high for all of Chicago elite to see was Blair. She was clearly heavily intoxicated, her hair wild, her eyes glassy and unfocused as she gripped the steering wheel of my vehicle. The entire ballroom gasped in a collective unified horror as the video showed the precise moment of impact. The loud, sickening thud of the car striking the pregnant pedestrian echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. Several women in the audience screamed, turning their faces away, but unable to completely look away from the glowing screens. The footage continued playing relentlessly. It showed Blair panicking, looking around wildly in the dark. It showed her actively wiping down the steering wheel with her expensive silk scarf. It showed her grabbing my spare driver license from the center console. The camera perfectly captured the cold, calculating expression on her face as she deliberately rolled down the window and tossed my identification out onto the wet street, intentionally planting the false evidence right next to the bleeding victim. But Marcus and I were not finished. The video transitioned smoothly into the synchronized audio recording we had pulled from Blair, cloned iPad messages matching the exact timeline of the crash. The powerful ballroom speakers now broadcast the frantic ongoing phone call between Blair and my mother. The audio was crystal clear, echoing off the high gilded ceilings. The crowd listened in absolute stunned silence as my mother's sharp, authoritative voice filled the room. "Leave her there," Blair, my mother's voice commanded through the speakers, hard and utterly devoid of humanity. "Wipe down the wheel and throw Harper identification on the ground. The police will absolutely think she did it. Harper can survive a few years in a minimum security facility. She has no real reputation to protect anyway. Do not ruin your life over this. Run." The recording clicked off, leaving the ballroom in a state of profound, deafening silence. No one moved a single muscle. No one spoke a single word. The absolute sheer magnitude of the pure evil they had just witnessed completely paralyzed the crowd of 3,000 people. The elite members of society, who had spent the entire evening sipping expensive champagne and admiring Blair's designer gown, were now looking at her like she was a highly contagious lethal disease. They were looking at my parents with absolute unmasked revulsion. The perfect, flawless American family had been completely gutted, flayed open, and exposed to the harsh, glaring light of absolute truth. Blair was sobbing now, loud, jagged, gasping sobs that racked her entire body. She sank to her knees right there in the middle of the polished marble floor, her $5,000 emerald gown pooling around her like a dark green stain. She reached her hands out toward Marcus, toward my parents, toward anyone who would save her, but the crowd actively, physically backed further away. My mother was clutching my father's arm, her face completely buried in his shoulder, unable to look at the massive screens or the horrified faces surrounding them. My father just stood there, the manila folder dangling uselessly from his hand, a broken, entirely ruined man. I stood perfectly still, watching the utter devastation unfold around me. I felt no pity for them. I felt no sorrow for their destroyed legacy. I felt only the deep, absolute warmth of pure, unadulterated justice. The trap we had meticulously set had not just snapped shut, it had completely obliterated them. They had believed they were the apex predators, the incredibly smart architects of my downfall. They had forgotten that I was the one who tracked the numbers, the one who built the spreadsheets, the one who always found the hidden truth. The entire room watched in horrified, fascinated silence as the two plainclothes detectives finally stepped forward from the foyer, their heavy footsteps echoing loudly across the marble floor, their hands reaching for the cold steel handcuffs waiting on their belts. The sharp, metallic ratcheting sound of the heavy steel handcuffs being unclipped from the detective leather belt echoed through the massive ballroom like the final tolling of an execution bell. The absolute paralysis that had gripped the elite crowd of 3,000 wealthy donors finally broke, but nobody moved to help the golden child. They simply parted like the Red Sea, allowing the two tall plainclothes detectives to march straight toward the center of the polished marble floor, where Blair was still kneeling in her own expensive spilled champagne. The sheer visual contrast of the scene was completely staggering. Blair was wearing a $5,000 custom emerald green designer gown, her hair pinned up in a flawless, intricate style, and diamonds sparkling wildly at her ears and throat. But the men towering over her were hardened, violent crimes detectives who did not care about her country club membership or her husband's prestigious surgical career. The lead detective, a man with sharp gray eyes and a deep, gravelly voice, looked down at my sister with absolute, unfiltered professional disgust. "Blair Dixon," he said, his voice projecting clearly across the dead, silent room, "you are under arrest for leaving the scene of an accident involving severe bodily injury, felony reckless driving, and felony evidence tampering. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The reality of the Miranda warning hitting the air completely shattered Blair's fragile psychological shell. She let out a piercing, high-pitched scream that sounded like a wounded animal. She tried to scramble backwards, scrambling on the slick marble floor, her expensive designer heels sliding out from under her. "No!" she shrieked, thrashing her arms wildly as the second detective firmly grabbed her wrists and yanked them firmly behind her back. "You cannot do this to me. I am a surgeon wife. Do you know who we are? It was an accident. I was scared. Harper is the one who belongs in jail. Tell them, Harper. Tell them it was your car." The detective did not even blink at her hysterical high society entitlement. He simply secured the heavy metal cuffs around her delicate wrists with a loud, decisive click. "You have the right to an attorney." The detective continued, completely ignoring her frantic thrashing. "If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." Blair twisted her body toward the stage, her face completely smeared with expensive makeup and bitter tears. "Marcus," she screamed, her voice raw and utterly desperate. "Marcus, please help me. Call your lawyers. Pay them whatever they want. Tell them I am sick. Tell them I need a hospital. Please do not let them put me in a police car." Marcus stepped down from the elevated stage and walked slowly toward the center of the ballroom. The crowd watched with bated breath, expecting the wealthy doctor to perhaps shield his humiliated wife from the glaring eyes of his colleagues. But Marcus did not reach out to comfort her. He did not offer his suit jacket to cover her cuffed hands. He stopped exactly 3 feet away from her, maintaining a cold, absolute clinical distance. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored tuxedo and pulled out a thick, tightly folded legal document. He looked down at the woman he had loved and supported for 3 years, and his eyes were entirely, completely dead. "I am not calling my lawyers to help you, Blair," he said, his voice a low, vibrating hum of absolute finality. "I called my lawyers to protect myself from you." He held the document out and dropped it onto the marble floor right at her designer shoes. "Those are your official divorce papers. They were filed electronically this morning. And before you start doing the mental math on how much of my money you can extract to fund your criminal defense team, you should know that I spent the entire week freezing every single one of my liquid assets. I legally locked you completely out of my family trust. You have absolutely zero access to my accounts, my credit cards, or my home. You're going to face a judge completely broke, entirely alone, and exactly as ugly on the outside as you have always been on the inside." Blair stared at the folded divorce papers on the floor, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The absolute finality of his words completely broke her. The golden child, the woman who had skated through her entire life completely insulated by wealth and parental favoritism, finally realized she had absolutely nothing left. She collapsed entirely, sobbing uncontrollably against the cold marble floor, her beautiful emerald gown tangling around her legs like a heavy green cage. But the absolute destruction of my toxic family was only 50% complete. The lead detective turned his cold grey eyes away from Blair and locked his gaze directly onto my parents. Richard and Susan Dixon had been slowly backing away from the center of the room, desperately trying to melt into the crowd of wealthy onlookers. They wanted to distance themselves from their ruined golden child to preserve whatever tiny shred of dignity they had left. But Evelyn Vance, our brilliant defense attorney, pointed directly at them. "Detectives," Evelyn said, her voice ringing out crisp and clear. "Those are the co-conspirators." The 2 detectives moved swiftly, abandoning Blair on the floor and marching directly toward my mother and father. My father, Richard, immediately threw his hands up in a defensive, panicked gesture. "Now, hold on a minute," he stammered, his voice shaking violently. "We had absolutely nothing to do with that crash. We were not in the car. We are upstanding citizens of this community. You cannot just arrest us without a warrant." The second detective pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket, displaying the bold black stamp of a judge's signature. "I have 2 felony arrest warrants right here," Richard the detective stated bluntly. "Richard and Susan Dixon, you are both under arrest for aiding and abetting a fleeing felony, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and witness tampering. Put your hands behind your backs right now." My mother let out a shrill, terrified wail. She grabbed my father's arm, her perfectly styled hair completely falling out of place. "Richard, do something," she screamed hysterically. "Call the mayor. Call the police commissioner. We play golf with the district attorney. We cannot go to jail. We are not criminals." But my father had no power left. The detective grabbed his arms and roughly spun him around, slamming him against a high-top cocktail table and slapping the steel cuffs onto his wrists. My mother, seeing the metal bite into my father's skin, completely lost her mind. She turned toward me, her eyes wide with a frantic, sickening desperation. "Harper!" she cried out, lunging toward me before the detective could grab her. "Harper, please tell them. Tell them we were just trying to protect our family. You know how sensitive Blair is. We did not mean to hurt you. We just needed you to take the blame because you are so strong. Please, baby, please do not let them take your mother away in handcuffs." I stood perfectly still, my midnight blue tailored suit, feeling like an impenetrable suit of armor. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who had explicitly told my sister to leave me to rot in a minimum security prison because I was entirely disposable. I did not raise my voice. I did not show her a single ounce of anger or sorrow. I simply looked at her with the exact same cold, absolute detachment she had shown me my entire life. "You are not my family," I said, my voice carrying perfectly in the silent room. "You are just the criminals who stole my money to fix a murder weapon. Enjoy yourself, Susan. I hear they do not serve expensive champagne in the county lockup." The detective grabbed her by the shoulders, pulling her roughly backward and securing her wrists behind her back. My mother sobbed wildly, her false high society facade completely obliterated, leaving behind nothing but a pathetic, terrified shell. The sheer spectacle of the public walk of shame was something I will remember with absolute clarity for the rest of my natural life. The two detectives hauled Blair up from the floor, forcing her to walk. Another pair of uniformed officers had arrived at the ballroom entrance, and they took custody of my parents. The three of them, my mother, my father, and the golden child, were forced to march straight through the center of the grand ballroom. They had to walk past every single hospital board member, every wealthy donor, and every elite socialite they had spent decades trying to impress. The crowd actively shrank back away from them, turning their heads in pure physical revulsion. Nobody offered a word of comfort. Nobody stepped forward to vouch for their character. They were paraded under the brilliant crystal chandeliers, completely stripped of their wealth, their status, and their freedom. Blair kept her head down, her emerald gown dragging heavily on the floor, her sobs echoing loudly. My mother wept hysterically, her velvet dress wrinkled and her mascara running in dark black streaks down her face. My father walked with a hollow, empty stare, completely broken by the public annihilation of his precious legacy. I stood there in the center of the room with Marcus and Evelyn by my side and watched the heavy mahogany doors finally close behind them, shutting them completely out of my life forever. The toxic, heavy, suffocating weight that had pressed down on my chest for 28 years instantly vanished. I did not feel a single drop of guilt or remorse. I felt light. I felt incredibly, undeniably powerful. They had treated my existence like a dumping ground for their sins. They had demanded that I sacrifice my freedom on the altar of their vanity, but I had refused to be their quiet victim. I had used their own staggering arrogance and their own financial greed to build the exact cage they were now locked inside. I turned away from the doors and looked at Marcus, who offered me a small, genuine smile of profound respect. The nightmare was officially over. The predators had been captured, and the invisible, disposable sister was finally, entirely, and beautifully free to reclaim her life on her own absolute terms. The justice system moved with a swift and incredibly heavy hand once the absolute truth was entirely exposed. I sat in the front row of the federal courtroom several months later, watching with complete clarity as the judge delivered the final devastating blow to my sister. Blair stood, trembling before the bench, wearing a shapeless standard-issue beige jumpsuit that had completely stripped away her designer glamour and her endless high society arrogance. She was officially sentenced to 7 incredibly hard years in federal prison. The formal charges were undeniably severe. She was convicted of a felony hit-and-run driving under the influence and aggravated identity theft for deliberately planting my physical driver license at the bloody scene of the crime. There were absolutely no fake country club tears that could possibly save her, and no wealthy, influential husband left to buy her way out of a concrete cell. Marcus finalized his incredibly quiet and efficient divorce exactly as he had meticulously planned. He walked away with full absolute custody of his generational wealth, his pristine medical reputation, and a profound, beautiful peace of mind, knowing he was finally free of her toxic manipulation. My parents did not fare any better in their own miserable legal battles. The massive, staggering legal fees required to defend themselves against an absolute mountain of digital and federal evidence completely drained their remaining liquid assets within just a few short weeks. They desperately tried to take out massive loans to cover their aggressive defense attorneys, but the local banks quickly realized they had absolutely no reliable income. I had immediately and permanently stopped depositing those monthly $3,000 payments into their joint account the very morning after they were arrested. Without my quiet, invisible financial support to prop up their lies, they could not keep up the grand illusion of wealth for even a single month. The bank swiftly and ruthlessly foreclosed on their pristine suburban colonial house, and all their expensive mahogany furniture was auctioned off to pay their mounting desperate debts. They were both ultimately sentenced to 3 solid years in a federal facility for aiding and abetting a fleeing felon and felony obstruction of justice. They lost their beautiful home, they lost their precious golden child, and they lost their entire perfectly curated social standing. But the most important and deeply beautiful resolution of this entire terrifying nightmare had absolutely nothing to do with my toxic family. The pregnant woman that Blair had so callously struck down on that freezing, rainy night made a complete and miraculous full recovery. Marcus used his immense hospital influence and his personal charity foundation to quietly ensure that every single one of her extensive medical bills was completely and entirely covered. Her baby was born perfectly healthy and completely safe, bringing pure joy to an innocent family. Knowing that the innocent victim was alive and thriving was the absolute greatest closure I could have ever asked for. I have spent a massive amount of time reflecting on the dark, twisted reality of what family is truly supposed to mean. Society constantly conditions us to believe that sharing the exact same blood means you owe people your absolute blind loyalty. We are told from childhood to constantly forgive our parents and unconditionally protect our siblings simply because we share a genetic code. But blood does not give anyone the fundamental right to use you as a disposable human shield to protect their own terrible, selfish mistakes. Blood does not ever entitle someone to erase your future to preserve their perfect, fragile vanity. Setting strict boundaries with toxic people is not just a polite self-care strategy to protect your emotional peace. Sometimes, drawing a hard, absolute line in the sand is about protecting your literal, physical freedom and your actual survival. I spent 28 entire years making myself incredibly small and completely invisible, just hoping to eventually earn a tiny fraction of their conditional parental love. I was the silent, reliable scapegoat who absorbed all of their terrible flaws so they could comfortably pretend to be absolutely perfect. But the moment I stopped absorbing their poison, the moment I finally held up a mirror to their profound cruelty, their entire world completely collapsed. I am absolutely thriving now. I took all of my sharp forensic accounting skills and finally opened my very own successful financial firm right in the heart of downtown Chicago. I have incredible dedicated clients, a beautiful safe home, and a chosen family of friends who love me for exactly who I am. I have completely let go of the heavy, suffocating guilt they tried to permanently chain to my soul, and I have never once looked back at the wreckage they brought upon themselves. If you have ever had to stand up to a deeply toxic family that desperately tried to make you the permanent scapegoat for their own horrible decisions, please hit that like button and subscribe right now. Your incredible support helps these vital stories reach the exact people who desperately need the courage and the strength to finally fight back against their own abusers. You never have to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. And please let me know down in the comments, where exactly are you watching from today and what time is it there right now? I absolutely love reading about where all of you are joining from and connecting with this amazing community of survivors. Remember that you do not have to accept the terrible background role that toxic people assign to you just because they call themselves your family. You hold the pen, and you have the absolute power to rewrite your own incredible future. You truly deserve to be the strong, independent, and unbothered main character of your own beautiful life. Until next time, please stay strong, set your boundaries, and always protect your peace.